Hello friends, I'm here to help you relax tonight. Tell me where you listening from and what time is it there? I'd love to know. Now get comfortable, let go of the day's worries, and let this story guide you to a calm and peaceful sleep. You deserve to feel at ease and leave all the stress behind. Subscribe now and join me for more stories to help you find peace. It was one of those nights when the silence felt heavier than usual. Emily sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. Sleep seemed like a distant memory, as if it had abandoned her completely. Her fingers drummed nervously on the wooden table, her phone lying untouched beside her. The glow of the street lights outside filtered through the blinds, casting eerie patterns across the room. She felt uneasy, like something was out of place, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Emily had always considered herself rational, the kind of person who brushed off strange noises or flickering lights. But tonight felt different. A chill crept up her spine, the kind you feel when someone's standing too close. She shook her head, muttering under her breath, "Stop being ridiculous." Just as she reached for her phone, a faint knock echoed through the apartment. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't loud, more like a gentle tapping, as if someone was testing her patience. She froze, staring at the door. Her mind raced. Who would knock at this hour? She lived alone, had no friends nearby, and certainly wasn't expecting visitors. The knock came again, slightly louder this time. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She hesitated, debating whether to check or pretend she hadn't heard it. The tapping turned into a rhythmic knock, almost playful, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side enjoyed her unease. Emily grabbed a kitchen knife, her hands shaking as she approached the door. Peeking through the peephole, she saw nothing. The hallway was empty. Her chest tightened, and a wave of nausea washed over her. "Maybe it's just kids messing around," she whispered to herself, trying to stay calm. But deep down she knew better. As she turned away from the door, the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. She spun around, knife in hand, and yelled, "Whoever you are, leave now. I'm calling the police." The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence returned, but it was different now. Heavy. Oppressive. Emily pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear any movement outside. And then she heard it, a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably real. It was coming from the other side of the door. Emily? Her blood ran cold. Whoever, or whatever, it was knew her name. She stumbled back, the knife slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. "Who are you? What do you want?" she screamed, her voice cracking with fear. The whisper came again, softer this time, but closer. "Emily, let me in." She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No, leave me alone." Suddenly, the lights in the apartment flickered. The hum of the refrigerator stopped, plunging the room into an eerie silence. Emily backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room. Then the knocking started again, louder, faster, more desperate. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from inside the apartment. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the sound. There, in the corner of the living room, the shadows seemed to shift and move. A figure slowly emerged, its outline barely visible in the dim light. "Emily?" The voice was no longer a whisper. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. She screamed, stumbling backward and tripping over the coffee table. The figure moved closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate. Emily scrambled to her feet, grabbing a nearby lamp and hurling it toward the intruder. The lamp shattered on the floor, but the figure didn't flinch. It kept advancing, its form becoming clearer with each step. Its face, if you could call it that, was featureless, a blank void that seemed to suck the light from the room. Emily backed into the corner, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt trapped, her mind racing for a way out. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice echoing through the apartment. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if mocking her fear. Then it raised an arm, pointing directly at her. "Let me in," it said again, its voice reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, her hands covering her ears. "This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real," she repeated over and over, her voice barely a whisper. When she finally opened her eyes, the figure was gone. The apartment was silent once more, the lights steady, the hum of the refrigerator back. She sat there, trembling, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had she imagined it? Was she losing her mind? And then her phone buzzed. She grabbed it with shaking hands, her eyes widening as she read the message on the screen. "Why didn't you let me in?" Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the screen, the message glowing in the dim light of her apartment. Her breath hitched, and the air seemed to thicken around her. She read the words again. "Why didn't you let me in?" Her first instinct was to delete the message, to convince herself it was a prank, a cruel, sick joke from someone who had somehow gained access to her number. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just someone messing around. The room felt colder now. She clutched her phone tightly, her mind racing with possibilities. Who could it be? A stalker? A stranger watching her from somewhere she couldn't see? Or something worse? The phone buzzed again, startling her. She nearly dropped it. Another message appeared. "I'm still here." Her heart slammed against her ribcage. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Every corner seemed darker than it should have been, as though the shadows themselves were alive, waiting for her to let her guard down. Emily forced herself to move. She locked the front door with trembling hands, then double-checked the windows. Everything was secure, but it didn't make her feel any safer. She considered calling the police, but what would she even say? That someone, or something, had been knocking on her door, whispering her name, and now was texting her? They'd think she was crazy. Her phone buzzed a third time. This time, she hesitated before looking. Slowly, she turned the screen toward her. "Look behind you." Emily froze. The words seemed to leap off the screen, embedding themselves in her mind. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as though someone, or something, was breathing down her neck. Her instinct was to run. But run where? The apartment was small, there was nowhere to hide. Her body felt paralyzed, torn between the primal urge to flee and the overwhelming terror of what she might see if she turned around. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage, she spun around, knife clutched tightly in her hand. Nothing. The room was empty. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. She scanned the room, her eyes lingering on the shadows in the corners, but there was no one there. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky. "You're scaring yourself." But just as she started to turn back toward the door, she noticed something. The mirror on the wall. It wasn't reflecting the room as it should have been. Instead, the reflection showed her standing alone in the middle of the room, except she wasn't alone. Behind her, just out of reach, was a figure. Tall, dark, and faceless, it loomed over her reflection, its hand reaching toward her. Emily whipped around again, her knife slashing through the air. Still, there was nothing there. Her breathing was ragged now, panic setting in. She grabbed her phone and typed a frantic message to her best friend, Sophie. "Something's wrong. I think someone's in my apartment. Please come over. Now." She hit send and waited, her heart pounding. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours before the phone buzzed with Sophie's reply. "Are you okay? I'll be there in 10. Stay on the line." Emily exhaled shakily, feeling a small glimmer of relief. She called Sophie, the ringing in her ear grounding her slightly. When Sophie picked up, her voice was calm but firm. "Emily, I'm on my way. Stay on the phone with me. Lock yourself in the bathroom if you have to, but don't hang up." Emily nodded, even though Sophie couldn't see her. "I'm scared, Sophie. I don't know what's happening." First there was knocking, and then messages. And the mirror. Her voice broke and she couldn't continue. "It's okay," Sophie said, her voice soothing. "Just stay calm. I'm almost there." Emily clutched the phone like a lifeline, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. Minutes passed in agonizing silence, each second feeling like a lifetime. And then the knocking started again. Her head snapped toward the door. This time it wasn't soft or rhythmic. It was loud, frantic, as though someone, or something, was trying to break it down. "Sophie," Emily whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible. "It's back." "What's back?" Sophie's voice was sharp now, laced with urgency. "The knocking. It's not normal." "It's not?" The knocking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, almost worse than the sound itself. "Emily, listen to me," Sophie said, her tone firm. "Don't open the door. No matter what, don't." Before Sophie could finish, Emily's phone buzzed with another text. Her hand trembled as she glanced at the screen. "I'm inside." Emily's blood turned to ice. She dropped the phone, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to shift and move, closing in on her. Emily? Emily? Sophie's voice was muffled, faint, as though it were coming from far away. Emily didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the hallway leading to her bedroom. The door was ajar and she could see something, someone, standing just beyond it. A figure stepped into view, its form barely illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. It was the same faceless entity from the mirror, its presence suffocating and unnatural. Emily, the voice was a low growl now reverberating through the apartment. She stumbled backward, her legs weak beneath her. The knife slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. The figure moved closer, its faceless head tilting as if to study her. Its hand reached out, long and claw-like, pointing directly at her. "Let me in," it said again, the words like nails on a chalkboard. Emily screamed, her voice raw with terror. She backed into the corner of the room, her mind racing for a way out. And then the doorbell rang. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the apartment, cutting through the oppressive silence like a lifeline. For a moment, Emily froze, her mind struggling to reconcile the mundane sound with the terror that had consumed her. The figure in the hallway paused, its faceless head snapping toward the front door. Emily's heart pounded as she watched its movements. It wasn't human. Everything about it, from the way it moved to the way it seemed to absorb the light around it, screamed unnatural. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, as though whoever was outside was growing impatient. "Emily?" Sophie's voice came faintly from the other side of the door. "It's me. Open up." Emily's legs felt like they were made of lead, but the sound of Sophie's voice spurred her into action. She pushed herself off the floor, her eyes never leaving the figure in the hallway. It didn't move, but she could feel its gaze, or whatever it used in place of eyes, boring into her. "I'm not alone," Emily whispered, her voice shaking as she edged toward the door. "What?" Sophie called out, her voice muffled but urgent. "Emily, what are you talking about? Open the door." Emily glanced at the figure again, half expecting it to lunge at her. But it remained still, its presence like a black hole sucking all the courage out of her. "Sophie?" Emily's voice trembled as she reached for the lock. "Don't come in." "What? Emily, are you okay? Let me in now." Sophie's voice was insistent, laced with worry. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. She wanted nothing more than to open the door, to let Sophie's presence chase away the suffocating fear that gripped her. But something deep inside her screamed that it wasn't safe. The figure in the hallway began to move again, its steps slow and deliberate. Emily's breath hitched as it came closer, its form becoming more defined in the dim light. It stopped just a few feet away, its faceless head tilting slightly, as though it were mocking her hesitation. The doorbell rang a third time, accompanied by frantic knocking. "Emily, open the door." The sound startled her into action. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and yanked it open, pulling Sophie inside and slamming the door shut in one swift motion. "What the hell is going on?" Sophie demanded, her eyes wide with concern. Emily didn't answer. She grabbed Sophie's arm and pulled her toward the living room, her eyes darting back toward the hallway. It was empty. I don't know," Emily stammered, her voice barely audible. "Something's in here. It knows my name." Sophie frowned, glancing around the room. "Emily, there's no one here." "There was," Emily insisted, her voice rising. "It was standing right there." She pointed toward the hallway, her hand shaking uncontrollably. Sophie placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, trying to calm her. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe now. Whatever you think you saw, it's gone." But Emily wasn't convinced. The apartment felt different now, heavier somehow. She could still feel its presence, lingering just out of sight. Sophie guided her to the couch and sat beside her. "Start from the beginning. What happened?" Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She recounted everything, the knocking, the messages, the figure in the mirror, and the chilling voice that had whispered her name. Sophie listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief. When Emily finished, Sophie shook her head. "Emily, are you sure you weren't dreaming? Or maybe you're just stressed. You've been working non-stop, barely sleeping." "I'm not imagining this," Emily snapped, her voice filled with desperation. "It was real, Sophie. I know what I saw." Before Sophie could respond, the lights flickered again. Both women froze, their eyes darting toward the overhead light. "Sophie," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's still here." The room plunged into darkness. The hum of the refrigerator stopped once more and the air grew cold. "Stay close to me," Sophie said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her tone. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The light fell on the hallway, illuminating the empty space. But Emily knew better. It was hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike. The phone buzzed in Emily's lap, the sound making her jump. She hesitated before picking it up, dread pooling in her stomach. A new message appeared on the screen. "Why did you let her in?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. She showed the screen to Sophie, who frowned. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Sophie asked, her voice shaking. Emily shook her head. "I don't think it's a person." The flashlight flickered, the beam growing dimmer. Sophie smacked the phone, trying to get it to work, but the light continued to fade until it blinked out entirely. The darkness was absolute now, swallowing the room whole. Emily could hear her own heartbeat, loud and frantic, as she clutched Sophie's arm. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Sophie nodded, her grip tightening on Emily's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." Before they could move, the growl turned into a voice, deep and menacing. "You shouldn't have let her in." The voice sent a chill down Emily's spine. She felt paralyzed, unable to move or even breathe. Sophie tugged at her arm. "Come on, we have to go." But before they could take a step, the sound of footsteps echoed through the apartment. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, they seemed to come from all directions. The shadows in the room began to shift and twist, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. Dozens of faceless figures emerged from the darkness, their forms flickering like static on a broken TV. Emily and Sophie backed into the corner, their eyes wide with terror. The figures moved closer, their featureless faces tilting in unison as they stared, or seemed to stare, at the two women. "What do you want?" Sophie shouted, her voice breaking. The figures stopped, their heads tilting in unison. Then one stepped forward, its voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Let us in." The room felt alive, pulsating with an otherworldly energy that made Emily's skin crawl. She clung to Sophie, her breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. The faceless figures loomed closer, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows like static on a dying screen. "Let us in," the voice repeated, colder and sharper this time, reverberating through the air as if the words themselves had weight. Emily couldn't comprehend what they meant. They were already inside, weren't they? She tried to rationalize it, to piece together the fragments of fear and reality, but her thoughts were scattered, drowned out by the oppressive dread that filled the apartment. Sophie, still clutching Emily's arm, stood frozen, her gaze locked on the figure that had stepped forward. Her lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but no words came out. The room felt suffocating, like all the oxygen had been sucked out, leaving nothing but cold, empty air. "Stay back." Sophie finally managed to yell, her voice shaking but loud enough to echo. The figure stopped, tilting its head again in that unervingly deliberate way, as if it were studying them. The other figures stood motionless behind it, their bodies unnaturally still, like statues waiting to spring to life. Emily's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could be used as a weapon. The knife she had dropped earlier was still on the floor near the kitchen, but it might as well have been miles away. The lead figure spoke again, its voice distorted, layered with something unnatural that made Emily's stomach churn. "She shouldn't be here." The word sent a chill down Emily's spine. She glanced at Sophie, whose face was pale but resolute. "Who are you?" Sophie demanded, her voice steadier now, though her grip on Emily's arm betrayed her fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised an arm, long and impossibly thin, and pointed at Sophie. She opened the door. "She brought us closer." Sophie's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" "Closer to what?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took another step forward, and the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows thickening like smoke. Emily couldn't take it anymore. "What do you want from us?" she cried, her voice breaking. The figure turned its faceless head toward her, and for a moment, she felt like the void where its face should have been was staring directly into her soul. "Let us in," it repeated, the words slow and deliberate as if speaking to a child. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't understand. You're already here. What do you mean? The figure didn't answer. Instead, the faceless crowd behind it began to move, their jerky, unnatural movements making Emily's stomach twist. They stepped forward in unison, their presence overwhelming the small apartment. Sophie grabbed Emily's hand. We're leaving. Now. Emily didn't argue. She let Sophie pull her toward the door, her legs barely able to move. The figures didn't follow, but their presence pressed against her back like a physical weight. When they reached the door, Sophie fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking. Emily glanced over her shoulder, and her heart sank. The figures were closer now, their forms impossibly tall and distorted. The lead figure stretched out its arm, the long claw-like hand reaching for her. Hurry, Emily urged, her voice frantic. The lock clicked, and Sophie yanked the door open. The hallway beyond was dark, the overhead lights flickering like they were on the verge of burning out. The normalcy of it should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The air out there felt just as oppressive as it did inside. Sophie pulled Emily into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind them. They didn't stop running until they were several floors down, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Finally, they stopped to catch their breath, leaning against the cold concrete walls. Emily's chest heaved as she tried to process what had just happened. What were those things? She managed to gasp. Sophie shook her head, her face pale and drawn. I don't know, but we're not going back up there. Emily nodded, though a part of her wondered if they were truly safe anywhere. The figures hadn't followed them into the stairwell, but she could still feel their presence, as though they were watching her from a distance. We need to call someone, Sophie said, pulling out her phone. The police, an exorcist, I don't know. Someone who can help. Emily didn't argue. She pulled out her own phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. But when she pressed the call button, nothing happened. Her stomach dropped. My phone's not working. Sophie frowned, glancing at her own screen. Mine either. No signal. Emily's heart sank. She felt the oppressive weight of the situation closing in on her again. They were cut off, alone. Before Sophie could say anything, the stairwell lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat. No, 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 she whispered, clutching Sophie's arm. A sound echoed through the stairwell, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from above them. They're coming, Sophie said, her voice barely audible. Emily's mind raced. They couldn't stay there, but where could they go? The figures were above them, and the only way out was down. Run, Sophie whispered, tugging on Emily's arm. They stumbled down the stairs, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the slow, steady rhythm of the ones above. The air grew colder with every step, and Emily felt as though something was closing in on them, unseen but suffocating. They reached the ground floor, bursting out into the lobby. The front doors were just ahead, the glass panels glowing faintly in the moonlight. Almost there, Sophie said, her voice strained. But as they approached the doors, Emily skidded to a halt, her blood running cold. The figures were there, standing just outside the glass. Dozens of them, maybe more, their faceless forms flickering like static. How? Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Emily shook her head, backing away. The figures didn't move, but their presence was enough to paralyze her with fear. Then the lead figure stepped forward, its claw-like hand pressing against the glass. You cannot leave, it said, its voice reverberating through the lobby. Emily felt a wave of despair wash over her. They were trapped. The sound of the lead figure's distorted voice felt like it seeped into Emily's bones, freezing her in place. Sophie tugged at her arm desperately, but Emily's legs felt rooted to the spot, as if the floor beneath her had swallowed her feet whole. You cannot leave, the voice echoed again, louder this time, reverberating through the glass doors like an ominous warning. The faceless figures outside stood motionless, their forms blending with the night like silhouettes carved out of shadow. Yet Emily could feel the intensity of their focus, as though every fiber of their being was trained on her and Sophie. We have to find another way out, Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible over the deafening silence. She yanked Emily's arm again, harder this time, snapping her out of her stupor. Emily blinked, her chest heaving as reality came crashing back. There's no other way out. The fire exits. Lead back to the alley, Sophie finished, her face pale. They'll be waiting for us there too. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't know what to do. Trapped like rats in a cage, every exit blocked by the same faceless horrors that had haunted her apartment. The figures outside didn't move, but the glass began to fog over, an icy mist creeping across its surface from the bottom up. The frost formed strange, swirling patterns, symbols that Emily didn't recognize but instinctively knew were wrong. "We can't just stand here," Sophie hissed, pulling her toward the hallway that led to the back offices. "We'll figure it out, but we need to move before they—" A loud crack interrupted her, the sharp sound ricocheting through the lobby. Emily's head whipped around, her heart pounding as she saw the glass begin to fracture. Tiny spiderweb cracks spread outward from where the lead figure's clawed hand pressed against the door. "They're coming in," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Sophie didn't wait for a response. She practically dragged Emily down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The overhead lights flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance and twist along the walls. As they ran, Emily's mind raced, every nerve in her body screaming at her to keep moving. But a gnawing question clawed at the edges of her thoughts. What did they want? They reached the end of the hallway, bursting into the building's maintenance room. The space was cramped and cluttered, filled with tools, cleaning supplies, and old, dusty equipment. "Help me block the door," Sophie said, already shoving a heavy shelving unit toward the entrance. Emily snapped out of her daze and joined her, pushing with all her strength until the metal unit scraped into place, wedged against the door. Sophie stepped back, breathing heavily. "That'll slow them down. For a minute, maybe." Emily leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her hands were trembling, and she felt like she might collapse at any moment. "What are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie shook her head. "I don't know. But whatever they are, they're not human." Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket, the sudden vibration making her jump. She pulled it out with trembling hands, dread pooling in her stomach as she saw another message flash across the screen. "You can't hide forever." Emily stared at the words, her blood turning to ice. She showed the screen to Sophie, who cursed under her breath. "This is impossible," Sophie said, running a hand through her hair. This shouldn't be possible." Another message appeared, this time accompanied by a chilling sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "She brought us closer." Sophie's face twisted in confusion. "What does that even mean? Who's she? Me?" Emily's eyes widened as the pieces began to click into place. The knocking, the messages, the figures, all of it had started after Sophie arrived. "Sophie," Emily hesitated, her voice shaking. "When you came to my door, did you see anything? Hear anything?" Sophie frowned, clearly taken aback. "No, of course not. I thought you sounded upset on the phone, so I came over." What are you trying to say?" Emily shook her head, guilt gnawing at her. "I don't know. It's just, everything got worse after you got here." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but a loud bang cut her off. Both women froze, their eyes snapping to the door. The sound came again, louder this time. The shelving unit rattled against the force, and the metal creaked ominously. "They're here," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily backed away, her heart pounding in her ears. The air in the room grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers began to fill the space. "Emily," the voice was soft, almost tender, but it sent a jolt of terror through her. She spun around, her eyes darting across the room. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Sophie asked, panic lacing her voice. "It said my name," Emily whispered, her breath hitching. The banging grew louder, more insistent, and the shelving unit began to slide inch by inch away from the door. "We need to get out of here," Sophie said, her voice trembling. She grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her toward the back of the room, where a small rusted vent cover was partially obscured by a stack of old crates. Sophie dropped to her knees and began yanking at the cover, her fingers scraping against the metal. "Help me." Emily snapped into action, joining Sophie as they pried the vent cover loose. The screws were old and rusted, and the metal bent under their combined effort. Behind them, the door gave a loud, final creak before it burst open, the shelving unit crashing to the floor. Emily didn't look back. She shoved Sophie toward the vent, practically pushing her inside. Go. Sophie crawled into the narrow passage, her movements frantic. Emily followed, the cold air inside the vent chilling her to the bone. She had barely squeezed her way inside when she heard the sound of footsteps entering the room. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her ears like a sinister chant. She glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of the figures as they entered the maintenance room. They didn't move like before. Their motions were jerky, almost insect-like, as they searched the space with unnerving precision. Emily turned back to the vent, her heart pounding as she crawled as fast as she could. The passage was cramped, the walls pressing against her shoulders, but she didn't care. All that mattered was getting as far away from those things as possible. "Where does this lead?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own breathing. "I don't know," Sophie replied, her voice tight. "But anywhere is better than back there." Emily couldn't argue with that. Behind them, the sound of scraping metal filled the air, followed by a low, guttural growl. "They're following us," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The vent stretched on endlessly, its cold, metallic walls closing in around them as Emily and Sophie crawled through the suffocating passage. Every scrape of their hands against the steel echoed like a scream in the confined space. Behind them, the whispers had morphed into guttural growls that grew louder with each passing second. Emily's mind raced as she tried to focus on moving forward, her palms slick with sweat. The air in the vent was stale, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. She risked a glance behind her, but the darkness was impenetrable. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Keep moving," Sophie urged, her voice barely audible. "We can't stop now." The vent split into two paths ahead, a left and a right. Sophie hesitated for a moment, her breathing labored. "Which way?" she asked, panic evident in her tone. Emily's gut churned. She didn't know. Both paths looked identical, stretching into black voids that promised no escape. "Just pick one," Emily hissed. Sophie turned left, and Emily followed without hesitation. The passage narrowed even further, forcing them to press their bodies against the freezing metal walls. The growls behind them were closer now, accompanied by a sound that made Emily's blood run cold, a scraping like claws dragging against steel. "They're in the vent," she realized, her voice barely a whisper. Sophie's movements became frantic, her pace quickening as she crawled with renewed urgency. "We have to get out of here. There has to be an exit." The vent began to slope downward, and the angle made it difficult to keep their balance. Emily's knees scraped against the metal, the pain barely registering over her growing terror. Suddenly, Sophie let out a startled yelp as the vent floor beneath her gave way. She slid down the steep incline, her screams echoing through the passage. "Sophie!" Emily cried, reaching out in a futile attempt to grab her. But it was too late. Sophie disappeared into the darkness, her screams abruptly cutting off. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The slope was directly in front of her now, and she could feel the cold air rushing up from below. She had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she pushed herself forward and let gravity take over. The descent was terrifying. The vent walls blurred around her as she slid faster and faster, her body slamming into the sides with every twist and turn. The metallic scraping sound from above was deafening now, as if the creatures were right behind her. Emily's mind raced with fear. What if the vent led to a dead end? What if she was sliding straight into a trap? Before she could think further, the vent suddenly leveled out, and she was thrown out onto a cold, hard surface. She landed with a painful thud, her head spinning. "Emily?" Sophie's voice called out, filled with relief. Emily blinked, trying to steady her vision. She looked up to see Sophie standing a few feet away, her figure illuminated by a dim, flickering light. They were in some kind of basement, a vast, cavernous space filled with old machinery and rusted pipes. The air was damp and smelled of mildew, and the faint hum of electricity filled the room. "You're okay," Sophie said, helping Emily to her feet. Emily nodded, wincing as she put weight on her scraped knees. "What is this place?" "I don't know," Sophie replied, glancing around nervously. "But we need to keep moving. They'll be here any second." As if on cue, a loud clang echoed from the vent above them, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy crawling through the passage. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "We have to go. Now." Sophie nodded, and the two of them hurried deeper into the basement, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. The machinery around them groaned and hissed as if alive, and the dim light cast long, shifting shadows on the walls. The basement seemed to stretch on forever, a maze of pipes and wires that made it impossible to tell which direction they were heading. Emily's sense of unease grew with every step, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional clang of metal from behind them. "Do you hear that?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Emily strained her ears and her stomach dropped. Beneath the sounds of their footsteps and the distant groans of the machinery, she could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from ahead of them. "We're trapped," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "They're everywhere." Emily clenched her fists, trying to steady her nerves. "We can't stop. If we stop, we're dead." They pressed on, the tapping growing louder with each step. The dim light flickered, plunging them into brief moments of darkness that made Emily's heart race. Suddenly, they rounded a corner and came face to face with a figure. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was one of them, a tall, faceless figure standing perfectly still in the center of the hallway. Its head tilted slightly as if studying them, and Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. "What do we do?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Emily could respond, the figure raised a hand, its long claw-like fingers pointing directly at her. "Run," Emily whispered. The two of them turned and bolted in the opposite direction, their footsteps echoing wildly. The figure didn't move, but the sound of tapping followed them, growing louder and more frantic. They reached a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway and threw it open, slamming it shut behind them. Emily leaned against the door, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "Do you think they can get through?" Sophie didn't answer. She was staring at something on the floor, a strange circular symbol carved into the concrete. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Sophie shook her head. "I don't know, but I've seen it before. At your apartment." Emily's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Sophie looked up at her, fear in her eyes. "That night when I came to your door, I saw this symbol carved into the hallway floor. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now..." Her voice trailed off as the tapping resumed, this time from the other side of the door. "They're here," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. The door rattled violently, and the room plunged into darkness as the flickering light finally gave out. The room was suffocatingly dark, the only sound the frantic rattling of the door as whatever was outside clawed and slammed against it. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed her back against the cold wall, trying to stay silent, trying to think. "We can't stay here," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. Emily didn't answer. Her mind was spinning. The carved symbol on the floor seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness, as if alive, and Sophie's words echoed in her head. "I've seen it before. At your apartment." "Why was it there?" Emily finally whispered, her voice shaking. "Why was that symbol at my place?" Sophie shook her head, her silhouette barely visible in the faint glow emanating from the strange marking. "I don't know, but it's not a coincidence. It's like it's following you." The thought sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She wanted to protest, to say it wasn't possible, but deep down she knew Sophie was right. Ever since the night the whispers began, everything had felt wrong. The door groaned, the sound of the hinges straining under the relentless assault snapping her back to the present. They didn't have much time. "We need to move," Sophie said, her voice more urgent now. "But where?" Emily hissed. "This room doesn't have another exit." Sophie turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the walls. Then she stopped, pointing at a faint outline in the far corner. "There, a hatch." Emily squinted, barely able to make out the rectangular outline of a trapdoor set into the floor. "Help me," Sophie said, already moving toward it. The two of them crouched by the hatch, their hands fumbling over the cold, rusted metal. Emily's fingers found the latch and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. "It stuck," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "Try again," Sophie urged, glancing nervously at the door as another deafening crash echoed through the room. The creatures were getting closer. Emily gritted her teeth and pulled with all her strength. The latch groaned, resisting her efforts, but finally gave way with a loud snap. The hatch creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft that plunged into the unknown. A faint draft of cold air wafted up, carrying with it a metallic, almost coppery scent that made Emily's stomach turn. "You first," Sophie said, her voice trembling. Emily hesitated for a split second before nodding. She swung her legs over the edge and began lowering herself into the shaft. The metal rungs of a ladder were cold and slick beneath her fingers, and she had to force herself to focus on each step as she descended into the darkness. Sophie followed close behind, the sound of her movements drowned out by the crashing above. As Emily climbed deeper, the faint glow from the room above disappeared entirely, leaving them in complete darkness. "How far down does this go?" Sophie whispered, her voice echoing in the confined space. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice strained. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of the shaft were closing in on her, the oppressive darkness pressing against her like a physical weight. Finally, her foot touched solid ground. "We're at the bottom," she called up to Sophie, her voice barely above a whisper. A moment later, Sophie joined her, and the two of them stood in silence, trying to get their bearings. The air was damp and cold, and Emily could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. "Where are we?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Emily didn't answer. She reached out blindly, her fingers brushing against a rough, uneven surface. "Stone." "We're underground," she said, her voice hollow. A faint light flickered in the distance, and Emily turned toward it, her heart pounding. "Do you see that?" Sophie asked, her voice tight with fear. Emily nodded, though she knew Sophie couldn't see her in the darkness. "Yeah." The light was weak and unsteady, casting eerie shadows on the damp stone walls. Without a word, the two of them began moving toward it, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As they drew closer, Emily realized the light was coming from a small lantern hanging on a rusted hook. Beneath it was an old wooden table, its surface covered in papers and strange objects. "What is this?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily approached the table cautiously, her eyes scanning the clutter. There were faded photographs, handwritten notes, and what looked like ancient artifacts. A small, intricately carved figurine, a tarnished locket, and a blade that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. Her fingers brushed against one of the photographs and she froze. It was a picture of her apartment building. "What the hell?" she murmured, her voice trembling. Sophie leaned over her shoulder, her eyes widening as she took in the image. "Why is that here?" Emily picked up the photograph, her hands shaking. Beneath it was another picture, this one of her and Sophie, taken from what looked like a street corner. "Someone's been watching us," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. Emily's stomach churned. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. "Who's doing this?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Before Sophie could respond, the faint sound of tapping reached their ears. It was coming from the tunnel behind them. "They found us," Sophie said, her voice trembling. Emily grabbed the blade from the table, its cold weight reassuring in her hand. "We need to go." "But where?" Sophie asked, panic creeping into her voice. Emily glanced at the papers on the table, her eyes scanning the hastily scrawled notes. One phrase caught her attention: "The circle must not be broken." "What does that mean?" Sophie asked, following Emily's gaze. "I don't know," Emily admitted. But deep down, she felt a chilling certainty that the symbol on the floor, the strange objects, and the whispers were all connected. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "We don't have time for this," Sophie said, grabbing Emily's arm. "We need to move. Now." Emily nodded, shoving the blade into her pocket and grabbing the lantern. Together, they plunged deeper into the tunnel, the faint glow of the lantern casting long, shifting shadows on the stone walls. As they ran, the tapping behind them grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of whispering. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and desperation. She didn't know where they were going or what they would find, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. The tunnel seemed endless, a winding, oppressive labyrinth of stone and shadows. The lantern Emily carried cast a feeble glow that barely lit the ground ahead of them. Every flicker of its light made the jagged walls feel alive, as though they were breathing, watching. Behind them, the tapping and whispering grew louder, a haunting cacophony that gnawed at their sanity. Emily's heart pounded as she stumbled forward, the blade cold and heavy in her pocket. Sophie clung to her side, her breathing shallow and erratic. The damp air was thick, clinging to their skin and filling their lungs like smoke. "Emily," Sophie gasped, breaking the tense silence. "How much further? Were we even going?" Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. There was no destination, no plan, just the primal instinct to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between them and whatever was hunting them. Emily? Sophie grabbed her arm, pulling her to a halt. What? Emily snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. Sophie pointed to the ground. At first, Emily didn't see it, but then her eyes adjusted, and her breath caught in her throat. There were footprints in the dirt. They weren't theirs. The prints were large, impossibly so, with clawed toes that dug deep into the soil. They stretched ahead of them, disappearing into the darkness of the tunnel. "They're not human," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Emily nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She tightened her grip on the lantern, the fragile glass trembling in her shaking hand. The two of them stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, their eyes locked on the tracks. Then, from somewhere far ahead, a low, guttural growl echoed through the tunnel. "Run," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. They sprinted forward, their footsteps pounding against the uneven ground. The growl grew louder, closer, joined by the sound of something massive moving through the tunnel. The walls seemed to close in around them, the darkness swallowing everything but the faint glow of the lantern. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted, and Emily stumbled, nearly losing her footing. "Stop," she yelled, grabbing Sophie's arm. "What is it?" Sophie panted, her eyes wide with terror. Emily held the lantern out, its light revealing a gaping chasm in the ground just a few feet ahead. The tunnel had collapsed, leaving a jagged hole that stretched across their path. "We can't go back," Sophie said, her voice trembling. Emily glanced behind them. The tapping and growling were closer now, echoing through the tunnel like a death knell. "There's no choice," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. She stepped to the edge of the chasm and peered down. It was impossible to see the bottom, but the faint sound of rushing water suggested it was a long way down. "We have to jump," she said, turning to Sophie. "Are you insane?" Sophie hissed. "We don't even know what's down there. Do you want to wait here and find out what's behind us?" Emily shot back. Sophie hesitated, her face pale. Then she nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You go first," Emily said, her voice softer now. Sophie took a deep breath and stepped to the edge. She glanced back at Emily one last time before leaping into the void. Emily's heart stopped as she watched Sophie disappear into the darkness. Then, without giving herself time to think, she followed. The fall was terrifying. The air rushed past her, cold and damp, and for a moment she felt weightless, suspended in the void. Then, with a bone-jarring impact, she hit the ground. The lantern shattered on impact, plunging them into total darkness. "Emily?" Sophie's voice called out, shaky but alive. "I'm here," Emily groaned, pain radiating through her body. She scrambled to her feet, her hands blindly searching for Sophie. The ground beneath them was wet and uneven, the sound of rushing water deafening. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," Sophie replied, her silhouette barely visible in the darkness. "But we need to move. They'll follow us down here." Emily nodded, even though Sophie couldn't see her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the blade, its cold surface a small comfort in the suffocating blackness. "Stay close to me," she said, her voice firm. Together, they stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the faint sound of water. The air grew colder with every step, and Emily's breath came out in visible puffs. "Do you hear that?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily strained her ears. At first, she heard nothing but the rush of water, but then it came, a low, rhythmic chanting carried on the icy wind. "What is that?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Emily replied, her grip tightening on the blade. They followed the sound, their footsteps echoing in the vast, unseen space. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, and Emily could feel the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. Finally, they emerged into a massive cavern, dimly lit by a series of glowing symbols etched into the walls. The symbols were identical to the one they had seen in the basement, their faint blue light casting eerie shadows across the stone. In the center of the cavern stood a circle of hooded figures, their voices rising and falling in a haunting, unearthly chant. Emily and Sophie froze, their eyes locked on the scene before them. "What the hell is this?" Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. Before Emily could respond, one of the figures turned toward them. It didn't have a face. The figure's empty, hollow face loomed out of the shadows, its head tilting slightly as if examining them, its gaze unseen but profoundly felt. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering in her chest. Sophie stepped closer to her, trembling, and the two of them stood frozen, unable to tear their eyes away from the faceless figure. The chanting stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on them from all sides. Emily felt her skin crawl, every nerve screaming for her to run, but she couldn't move. The air had thickened, charged with an unseen energy that seemed to seep into her very bones. Then, without warning, the figure raised its hand. Slowly, deliberately, it gestured for them to approach. Emily's mind screamed that this was a trap, that they should turn and flee, but her legs refused to listen. Every instinct told her to stay, to move forward. "Don't," Sophie whispered, gripping Emily's arm, but Emily shrugged her off, unable to resist. There was something compelling about that figure, something that tugged at the deepest, most primal part of her being. Slowly, she began to move toward it, each step echoing in the cavernous space. Sophie hesitated for a moment before following, her footsteps barely audible behind Emily. The cavern seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls shifting, closing in on them as they moved toward the circle. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, slick with the moisture that hung heavy in the air. Emily's mind raced, thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. What were they walking toward? Who were these faceless figures? And why did she feel as though she knew them, as if they had always been part of her life? As they reached the center of the cavern, the figures around the circle stood in perfect unison. They were silent now, waiting, their presence unnerving in its stillness. Emily's eyes darted from one hooded figure to another, but still, no face emerged from beneath the dark hoods. The chanting had stopped, but the air was thick with anticipation. "Why are they all here?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely a breath. She was standing so close to Emily now that their shoulders brushed, but the distance between them and the figures felt vast, overwhelming. Emily couldn't answer. She didn't even know what was happening anymore, but a nagging, relentless feeling churned in her stomach. This place wasn't just some random underground cavern. This was the heart of whatever nightmare they had stumbled into. This was where everything, every strange occurrence, every haunting moment had been leading them. One of the figures stepped forward, its slow, deliberate movement unnerving in its silence. It raised its arm, palm open, and a low hum filled the air. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating deep in Emily's chest, making her skin tingle. "Come closer," the figure's voice echoed through the cavern, a voice that was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was a strange mixture, impossible to place. The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very earth beneath their feet. "You've come all this way. You must understand." Sophie's grip tightened on Emily's arm. "What does it mean?" she whispered urgently. Emily didn't know. The words seemed to reverberate through her skull, drilling into her mind. She felt as though they were being pulled in, drawn toward the circle by an invisible force, each step further cementing their place in whatever twisted ritual was unfolding before them. "Why?" Emily managed to force the word out, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The figure lowered its arm, and the hum faded away, replaced by the silence once more. For a moment, nothing happened. The other figures did not move, did not speak. Then, with a sudden shift, the first figure stepped backward into the circle. The others followed, their movements synchronized and precise, as if they were one entity. "Everything has a purpose," the voice continued, the words now heavy and final. "The circle must not be broken. The ritual must be completed." Emily's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Ritual?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What ritual?" The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it raised its hand again, this time turning toward Emily and Sophie. There was no hesitation in its movement, no indication of thought or hesitation. The gesture was final, commanding. A chilling wind swept through the cavern, despite there being no visible source of it. The ground beneath Emily's feet rumbled as if it were waking from a long slumber. The faint hum returned, growing louder, more intense. "Your fate is sealed," the voice said, its tone now filled with something ancient, something cold and unyielding. "You are the final pieces. Without you, the circle cannot complete itself. Without you, the balance cannot be restored." The word sent a chill down Emily's spine, her blood running cold. She stumbled back, her mind racing as everything began to crash together. The whispers, the figures, the symbols, it was all connected. Everything had been leading her here to this moment. Balance? Sophie repeated, her voice cracking. What balance? What are you talking about? The figure stepped forward again, this time directly in front of Emily. The empty space where its face should have been seemed to pull her in, the darkness consuming her thoughts. The wind picked up, howling around them, and the hum grew louder still. The balance between the worlds, the voice said, its tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. The living, the dead, the space between. The veil must remain intact. The ritual must be completed. Emily's pulse raced. The veil? Between the worlds, she repeated, unable to understand. The figure extended a hand, the sleeve of its robe fluttering as though caught in the wind. It has already begun. The forces have been awakened. The ritual must end. Before Emily could react, the other figures moved in unison, their hands raised, their voices starting again in the low, rhythmic chant. The ground beneath them trembled, and a strange, unearthly light began to pulse from the center of the circle. A cold, suffocating sensation washed over Emily, and her vision blurred. The air grew thicker, pressing in from all sides, and she could feel a presence, something ancient, closing in around them. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The symbol on the floor of the basement, the photograph of her apartment, the shadows that had followed her, it was all part of this. She had been a part of this ritual from the beginning, and now there was no turning back. She wasn't just a witness, she was a necessary piece of the puzzle. But the question that echoed in her mind was louder than any other. What would happen if the ritual was completed? And what would happen if it wasn't? The air in the cavern felt thick and suffocating, almost as if it was alive, pulsating with an energy that Emily couldn't fully comprehend. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the sheer weight of what she was witnessing. The chanting, now deep and rhythmic, seemed to echo through the walls, reverberating in her chest, sending shockwaves through her nerves. It was as if the very earth was alive, drawing them deeper into the heart of whatever ritual was being performed. Sophie stood close beside her, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Emily," Sophie whispered, voice cracking. What is this place? What are they doing?" Emily could barely respond. Her mind was a swirl of confusion and fear. The figures in the circle were moving in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, their hands outstretched, their heads bowed. Despite their faceless nature, there was something undeniably powerful about their presence. The air around them crackled with ancient energy. The figure who had first spoken to them, the one who had gestured for them to come closer, now turned its empty gaze towards Emily once again. The motion was slow, deliberate. It wasn't just a simple movement, it was as if the very space around them bent and followed its lead. The figure's unseen eyes seemed to pierce through Emily into the deepest parts of her soul. "You are the key," the voice said again, its tone even more commanding this time. "Without you, the circle will fail. Without you, the balance will shatter." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What balance?" Her voice was small, barely a whisper in the vast, echoing cavern. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it reached out with its hands, fingers elongated and skeletal. Emily recoiled instinctively, but she couldn't move away. The unseen pull of the ritual kept her rooted to the spot, a prisoner in the web of whatever these beings were trying to weave. The circle of figures seemed to amplify their chant, each word vibrating in Emily's bones, setting her skin on fire with its power. The words were alien, the syllables twisting and warping in her mind, making it hard to concentrate, to keep her thoughts clear. Sophie took a step forward, her voice trembling with a newfound resolve. "Tell us what you want. Why are you doing this? What do you need from us?" The figure turned its head toward Sophie, and for a moment the cavern was dead silent. The figure raised one of its bony hands to its hood, pulling it back just slightly. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she saw what lay beneath. There was no face, not like she had expected. Not a void or a mask, but something far worse, a featureless, smooth surface. A pale, translucent skin stretched tight over a skull, devoid of any expression or emotion. It was as if the very essence of life had been drained away, leaving only an empty shell. Emily could feel the heat of Sophie's body next to hers, could hear the rapid beating of both their hearts, but the figure's gaze, if it could even be called that, was impossible to escape. It was as if the figure had no need for eyes, as if it could see into their very thoughts, into their very souls. The voice came again, but this time it was different. It was no longer just one voice, but a chorus, rising from the figures in the circle, blending together in perfect harmony, the words flowing as if they were the breath of an ancient creature. The veil, the chorus whispered in unison. The barrier between worlds. It must be maintained. And you are the final sacrifice. Emily's stomach dropped. The word struck her like a physical blow. Sacrifice. It was too much. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she stumbled, only to catch herself on Sophie's arm. Sacrifice? Sophie repeated, voice filled with disbelief and terror. No. We can't be part of this. We didn't ask for any of this. The figure in front of them reached out, its skeletal hand brushing Emily's cheek. Cold. Icy cold. Her entire body tensed at the touch, and for a moment she thought she might pass out from the sheer fear. You were always part of it, the figure said softly. You were chosen long ago. Emily's mind raced. Chosen? Oh, what? You, she started, but the words stuck in her throat. The chanting around them grew louder, the rhythm quickening, becoming more frantic. The symbols on the walls of the cavern pulsed in time with the chant, glowing brighter, the light seeping into every crack and crevice of the stone. The ground beneath them began to tremble once more. What's happening? Sophie screamed, her voice full of panic. The figures began to move, their arms rising higher, the chant reaching a fever pitch. The air felt as though it were splitting in two, as though the world itself was being torn apart. Emily felt the power of it, the weight of it, pressing down on her chest. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred. In that moment, everything seemed to shift. The space around them felt wrong. The shadows grew deeper, more oppressive, as if the darkness itself was alive, closing in on them, ready to consume them whole. And in the center of it all, the circle of faceless figures remained, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. The time has come, the figure's voice echoed, now louder, more commanding. You are the key, the final link in the chain. Emily's legs trembled beneath her, but she could no longer feel them. The world was spinning, her thoughts scattered. She felt herself being pulled forward, drawn to the center of the circle. Her hand reached out of its own accord, almost as if she had no control over it, and as her fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the figure's skin, she felt a searing pain shoot up her arm. Her vision went black. The darkness swallowed Emily whole. Her mind screamed, but there was no sound, no escape from the vast emptiness that surrounded her. Her body felt weightless, as though she were floating, suspended in a void where time had no meaning. It was as if the world itself had ceased to exist, leaving only a haunting silence. But even in that silence, Emily could feel the pull, the magnetic force that had drawn her in. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm echoing in the empty space. The cold, sharp sensation she had felt when her hand touched the figure's skin still lingered, a stinging burn that seemed to radiate deep inside her. She tried to move, tried to call out, but her voice was trapped, lost in the void. Her eyes were wide open, but there was nothing to see. No light, no shadows, only the consuming blackness. It felt like an eternity before the first sound broke through the silence. A faint whisper, distant but clear, like a voice calling her name. Emily? She flinched, but the voice wasn't coming from her body. It seemed to emanate from all around her, from the very air itself, bending and warping the space. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to break through the veil that surrounded her. Emily? The voice was familiar, but distorted, warped by something that felt wrong. It wasn't Sophie's voice. It wasn't anyone she knew. But somehow she knew it. She had heard it before. It was like an echo from her past, one she had forgotten until now. She tried to scream, to shout back, but her mouth wouldn't move. Her body was paralyzed, trapped in this endless abyss. Help me, the voice said, softer now, filled with desperation. The words sliced through her, deep into her soul. She felt a chill creep up her spine, but something else too, something cold and suffocating. The voice seemed to be coming closer, growing louder, until it surrounded her entirely. She could feel it in her mind, crawling beneath her skin, slipping into the deepest corners of her thoughts. It was a part of her, like a forgotten memory coming to life, a part of her that should have stayed buried. Suddenly, the darkness was no longer empty. Emily could feel the presence of something, someone, watching her, lurking in the corners of her consciousness. Her breath caught in her throat as she became aware of the weight of its gaze. The voice spoke again, clearer this time, no longer a whisper but a command. "Do not be afraid, Emily. You are where you belong." She shook her head, but her body remained still. She couldn't deny the truth of the voice, even though it felt wrong. There was something deeply unsettling about the words, something that sent a wave of nausea crashing through her. "Where do I belong?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. The presence seemed to laugh, the sound cold and hollow, like the wind howling through an empty house. "You are not like the others. You are the one they have waited for." Emily's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the words pressing down on her, crushing her chest. What did it mean? Who were they? And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the sensation vanished. The darkness receded, replaced by a rush of blinding light. Emily gasped, her body suddenly heavy, her lungs burning as she struggled to inhale. The light was blinding, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw shapes begin to form, shadows shifting around her. She could feel solid ground beneath her feet again, but it was strange, foreign, like she was somewhere else entirely. The air smelled of earth and decay, the sharp tang of something ancient and forgotten. She wasn't alone. The figures, those faceless shadows, were all around her again. But this time they were different. They were closer, their presence more real, more tangible than before. They stood in a circle, surrounding her, their faces still hidden, but she could feel their presence pressing against her, suffocating her. Her body trembled, every muscle screaming in protest as she tried to move, but her legs were rooted to the ground. Her mind raced, her thoughts scattered in a frenzy of confusion and fear. What was happening to her? What had she just experienced? The coldness, the darkness, was it real? Or was it just another trick, another part of the ritual she had become unwillingly a part of? The figure who had spoken to her, the one whose hollow face had haunted her mind, stepped forward again. Emily's breath caught in her throat as it raised its hand. This time, there was no hesitation in its movement. It was as if the air itself obeyed its command. "You have crossed the threshold," the figure intoned, its voice once again a low, echoing chorus. "You are no longer just a witness. You are the key." "No," Emily whispered, her voice raw, filled with panic. "I don't want this. I didn't choose this." The figure seemed to ignore her protests, its hand still raised as if it held the power to silence her. "You have already chosen," the figure continued, its voice growing colder, more final. "You are the one who will restore balance." Balance. The word echoed in her mind, reverberating through her very bones. But what balance? What was she supposed to restore? She had no answers. She had no idea what was going on, and the more she tried to understand, the more hopeless it seemed. Suddenly, the cavern began to shake again, a deep, rumbling force that vibrated through the walls and into her very soul. The figures around her remained motionless, but their energy was palpable, a force so strong that it made her feel small and insignificant. The symbols on the floor flared to life, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the chants of the figures. "Do you understand now?" the voice asked, its tone almost mocking. "You are the bridge, the connection between the worlds. Without you, the ritual cannot be completed." Emily's mind reeled. Ritual? Worlds? What did it all mean? Before she could respond, the world around her seemed to shift again. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, and she was falling, tumbling into an abyss of darkness once more. And then, everything stopped. The sudden stillness was deafening. Emily lay on the cold, hard ground, her body aching from the fall. She could hear nothing but the thudding of her own heart, her breath ragged as she slowly sat up. The darkness was gone. The figures were gone. But she was not alone. Standing before her, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure she knew all too well. A figure from her past. "Sophie?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. The figure nodded, but as Emily's eyes adjusted, she saw that it was not Sophie at all. It was something else. Something wrong. The face was twisted, a distorted version of Sophie's features, hollow and empty, with eyes that gleamed with an unnatural, terrifying light. And then it spoke. "The ritual has begun. There is no going back." Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the twisted version of Sophie standing before her. The face, once so familiar, so comforting, was now grotesque, contorted, and foreign. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and the eyes that gleamed back at Emily were not human. They were empty, void of warmth or kindness, and in their depths, there was something ancient and malevolent. "Sophie?" Emily whispered again, barely able to force the word past the lump in her throat. What's happening to you? The figure tilted its head to the side, its movements too smooth, too deliberate. It seemed to study Emily as though she were a puzzle to be solved. A cold, twisted smile spread across its lips, a smile that didn't belong on the face of someone Emily loved. It's not Sophie, Emily, the creature spoke, its voice warped, dripping with venom. Not anymore. Emily's chest tightened. She tried to stand, to move away, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She felt frozen, her body paralyzed by the sheer horror of what she was witnessing. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her with an unbearable weight. You were never meant to understand, the creature continued, stepping closer. You were only meant to serve. Serve? Emily's voice was barely a whisper, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what was happening. Serve who? The twisted figure smirked, its eyes gleaming with malice. You were always a part of this, Emily. The moment you stepped into this place, you sealed your fate. You were chosen to bridge the worlds. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The words reverberated in her mind, echoing in a way that made her skin crawl. Bridge the worlds. What did it mean? What was it asking of her? I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. Please, tell me what's going on. What is this place? Who are they? The creature's twisted smile widened. This place is where the veil between worlds is thinnest, it said. And those who seek to cross must offer a sacrifice. Your sacrifice? Emily felt the ground shift beneath her feet as the words hit her. Sacrifice. Her mind swirled, the room around her spinning in a dizzying whirl. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't be part of some dark ritual, some unholy scheme. She wasn't chosen. She was just Emily. But deep down, a terrible, gnawing feeling told her otherwise. It was all coming together, the visions, the whispers, the strange events that had led her to this moment. She had been drawn here as if by some unseen force, and now the truth was unraveling piece by piece. The twisted figure of Sophie advanced on her, its steps soundless but sure. You must accept it, Emily. You have no choice. Your world, our world, they are not so different after all. It's only the veil that keeps them apart. Emily's mind raced, but her body was still paralyzed, her thoughts trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and disbelief. She had to move. She had to fight. She couldn't let this happen. But then another voice echoed through the cavern, a voice so deep, so ancient, it sent a chill through her very bones. It's too late, Emily. She spun around, her eyes widening as a new figure emerged from the shadows. This one was taller, more imposing, with a presence that radiated power. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its aura was unmistakable. This was the one who had spoken to her earlier, the one who had guided her into the heart of the ritual. Who are you? Emily demanded, her voice shaky but defiant. What do you want from me? The figure stepped closer, its movements graceful and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. I am the one who keeps the balance, it said, its voice like the rumble of distant thunder. The veil between the worlds must remain intact. And you are the key to maintaining that balance. Emily's heart raced faster. The key. What did that mean? You must understand, the figure continued, without you, the barrier between the realms will collapse. The worlds will bleed into each other and chaos will consume everything. You are the only one who can prevent it. Emily shook her head, the weight of the figure's words sinking in slowly. But I don't want this. I don't want to be part of whatever this is. The figure's hidden face tilted slightly as if considering her words. You had no choice from the moment you entered. Your fate was sealed long ago. The ground beneath Emily seemed to tremble again and she stumbled, falling to her knees. She tried to push herself back up, but the world around her seemed to distort, twisting and warping as if it were coming undone at the seams. You're not alone in this, the figure added, its tone softening slightly. Sophie will be with you. She will guide you through the process. Emily's heart stopped. What do you mean? Where is Sophie? The figure remained silent for a moment, and then it lifted its hand, pointing toward the twisted version of Sophie, still standing a few paces away. She's not what she was, but she is the one who will walk with you until the end. Sophie's twisted form stepped forward, its eyes locked on Emily's. Don't fight it, it whispered, its voice a hollow echo of the real Sophie's. This is your destiny. The words pierced through Emily like a knife. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was not the Sophie she knew. This wasn't her friend. This was something else entirely, something dark and twisted. But as the ritual's grip tightened around her, Emily could feel the truth pressing against her mind, forcing her to confront it. She was a part of this. Whether she wanted to be or not, she was a link in this horrific chain, a bridge between the worlds. The weight of the ritual, the power of the forces at work, was too much to fight. She felt herself being pulled forward, dragged unwillingly into the heart of it. "Accept it," the figure in the hood said again, its voice a low, commanding force. There is no turning back now. The weight of the figure's words settled over Emily like a suffocating blanket. The air around her grew thick with an oppressive energy, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Her mind screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows that surrounded her seemed to close in tighter, and the strange, distorted version of Sophie loomed closer, its eyes now glowing faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. "You're not listening, Emily," Sophie's twisted voice whispered, her tone mocking, as though Emily was a child too stubborn to understand. "This is your path. You have no choice." Emily felt a surge of panic. Her chest tightened, her pulse racing in her ears. She could feel her knees trembling, threatening to give way beneath her. She didn't want this. She didn't want to be part of whatever this ritual was. But no matter how much she fought, she knew deep down that something was pulling her, forcing her to stay in this nightmarish place. As she looked around, everything felt different. The walls of the cavern, if that's what it even was, seemed to pulse with life, a sickly glow emanating from the jagged stones. The air was thick with the scent of decay, as though this place had been forgotten for centuries, hidden away from the world. Yet Emily knew it wasn't forgotten. It was waiting for her. Suddenly the air shifted, growing colder. A deep rumbling sound vibrated through the ground, and Emily felt the earth tremble beneath her. It wasn't just the cavern shaking, it was the world itself, as if reality was coming undone. Her eyes widened with terror as the realization hit her. This was bigger than her, bigger than anything she could comprehend. The figure in the hood stepped forward, its presence growing heavier with each step. Its voice was low and ominous, like the distant roll of thunder. "The veil is weakening. It is time. You must make your choice, Emily." Her breath caught in her throat. Choice? What choice was there? Everything she had known, everything she had believed, was crashing down around her. She was trapped in a world she didn't understand, and now she was supposed to make a choice? It was too much. The hooded figure reached out, its hand cold as ice as it brushed across Emily's trembling cheek. "You were chosen, Emily. You have always been the key." "Key? What do you mean?" Emily gasped, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. "I don't want to be a key. I don't want to be a part of this." The figure's grip tightened, its fingers pressing into her skin, sending a shock of coldness through her body. "You don't have to want it," it said, its voice now tinged with something darker, more dangerous. "It is your destiny. It is what you were born to do." The ground shifted beneath her feet again, but this time it was different. The vibrations were more intense, as though the very foundations of the world were being torn apart. The symbols on the ground, the ones she had seen earlier, began to glow, their light pulsing in time with the rumblings of the earth. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it was blinding, forcing Emily to squint against it. "No!" Emily screamed, unable to bear the rising panic coursing through her veins. She tried to pull away, but the figure's grip held her in place, its power too overwhelming. "You are the key, Emily," the figure repeated, its voice now a thunderous command. "The ritual will not be complete without you. You must make the sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" Emily gasped, her mind spinning. "What sacrifice? What do you want from me?" The figure's eyes, those dark, hollow depths, gazed into hers with an unyielding intensity. "You will open the gate. You will allow the worlds to merge, to become one." Emily's mind reeled. Open the gate? Allow the worlds to merge? It sounded insane, impossible, and yet she knew deep down that it was true. This was no dream. This was real. The walls, the shadows, the presence of the figure, it was all too tangible, too horrifying. This place, this ritual, it was happening. She was the one they had been waiting for. But the sacrifice, what sacrifice was she supposed to make? What would happen if she didn't do it? Would the worlds tear apart? Would everything be consumed by chaos? Was this what she had been brought here for? Before she could voice another question, the twisted figure of Sophie stepped forward again, its face now so close that Emily could feel the coldness radiating off of it. "You can't run from it," the creature hissed. "You can't escape what's coming." Emily's mind spun. She wanted to scream, to fight, to break free from whatever hold this place had on her, but her body wouldn't obey. Her legs were locked in place, her arms stiff and unyielding, as though they were shackled by invisible chains. "What are you asking me to do?" Emily finally whispered, her voice hoarse. The figure in the hood stepped forward, the power of its presence filling the air around them. Its hand moved to the center of the ritual circle on the ground, and Emily watched in horror as the symbols began to shift and change, swirling together, forming a new shape, an intricate, glowing pattern that seemed to pulse with energy. "You will open the gate," the figure said once more. "You will sacrifice your humanity to bind the worlds together. Only then will the ritual be complete." Sacrifice her humanity. The words echoed through Emily's mind like a death sentence. What did that mean? What would happen to her if she gave up her humanity? Would she cease to exist as Emily? Would she become something else entirely? But as the ritual circle began to hum with an unsettling power, Emily felt a strange sensation deep within her. A pulse, a beat, a rhythm that seemed to resonate with her very soul. It was as if the ritual was calling to her, drawing her in, tempting her with its promises. "You are the one who will restore balance," the figure in the hood said, its voice now a whisper. "You are the one who will merge the worlds." Emily's eyes flicked to the twisted version of Sophie once more, its eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. "You're the key, Emily," it repeated almost lovingly. "It's time to fulfill your destiny." The room around her seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening until they were nearly suffocating. The figures that had surrounded her before reappeared, standing in silent formation, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. They were waiting. Emily closed her eyes, the weight of the decision crushing her. What was she supposed to do? Could she really be the one to open the gate? Could she be the one to bridge the worlds, to unleash whatever horrors lay beyond the veil? She didn't know if she had a choice anymore. But before she could make up her mind, the ground shook again, harder this time. The air crackled with energy, and the glowing symbols on the floor flared to life, sending a brilliant, blinding light shooting upward. Emily opened her eyes, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The veil was starting to tear. The gate was opening. The ground beneath Emily trembled violently as the ritual reached its climax. The air was thick with an unearthly energy, crackling like static, as though the fabric of reality itself was being ripped apart. The symbols on the floor blazed with a fierce intensity, their light so bright that it seared her vision. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, as if the world was counting down to something terrible. The figure in the hood raised its arms high, the power flowing from it in waves, while the twisted version of Sophie stood motionless, its gaze fixed on Emily. The shadows around them writhed and twisted, reaching out like dark tendrils, crawling over the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. It was as though the very space was bending and warping in response to the ritual's power. Emily couldn't move. It wasn't just fear that held her in place now, it was the overwhelming pull of the ritual. Something deep inside her was awakening, something she couldn't understand or control. It was as if the ritual was calling to her, whispering to her very soul, urging her to comply. She felt her body begin to change, a strange energy surging through her veins, cold and unyielding. "This is it, Emily," the figure in the hood intoned, its voice booming like thunder. "The gate will open and you will fulfill your destiny. The worlds will merge and balance will be restored. But you must make the sacrifice." Emily's chest tightened. She didn't know what the sacrifice meant. She didn't know what would happen to her if she went through with it. She only knew that if she didn't, everything would be lost. The world, her world, would collapse and everything she knew would be consumed by chaos. Her mind screamed in terror, but her body was no longer her own. It was as though her very essence was tied to this place, to this ritual, and she had no choice but to obey. She glanced at Sophie, this creature that had once been her closest friend, and saw nothing of the person she had known. There was only emptiness in those eyes. The once warmth had been replaced with a chilling hunger. "Don't fight it, Emily," Sophie's twisted voice said again, its tone dripping with malice. "You were always meant to be here." The words cut through her, but there was no escape. She could feel the pull, the pressure, growing stronger with each passing second. The gate, whatever it was nearly open. She could hear it, the faint sound of something stirring beyond the veil. The worlds, the realms were about to collide. Emily took a step forward, her legs trembling beneath her. The energy in the room was so thick now that it was almost suffocating. Her skin felt alive with it, every cell vibrating with an unnatural hum. It was as though her very being was being pulled in two directions. One toward the ritual, the other toward something else, something darker. Now, Emily, the figure in the hood urged, its voice low and commanding. You must make the final step. Open the gate. She hesitated, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, a storm of fear, confusion, and desperation. Could she do it? Could she really be the one to merge the worlds? Was there even a choice? She didn't want to be part of this. She didn't want to sacrifice anything, let alone herself. But the energy was growing more intense, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She felt it pulling at her, urging her forward. The choice was no longer hers. It was as though the universe itself was demanding her compliance, and she had no way to resist. Make the sacrifice, the figure in the hood whispered, its voice growing softer now, almost tender. You must give up your humanity to complete the ritual. Emily's breath hitched. The words stung, but they also made sense in some twisted way. She could feel it. The sacrifice wasn't just about giving something up, it was about becoming something else, something beyond herself. She could feel the power coursing through her, the ancient forces at play, and she knew deep down that the moment she completed the ritual, everything would change. With trembling hands, she stepped forward, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that it drowned out the world around her. She felt the eyes of the figure in the hood on her, their weight pressing down on her like 1,000 tons of stone. The ground trembled again, a deep, resonating shake that made her bones ache. Sophie's twisted form reached out, its hand cold and unfeeling, grasping Emily's wrist with an iron grip. You're almost there, it said, its voice low and mocking. It won't hurt much. Emily could feel the creature's presence seep into her, wrapping around her like an icy tendril. She gasped, but there was no time to pull away. The light from the ritual circle grew blinding, and she could feel something inside her begin to unravel. Her thoughts were slipping away, her sense of self fading as the energy surged through her. Her vision blurred as the space around her began to distort. The walls twisted, the shadows deepened, and a low, terrifying hum filled her ears. It was as if the very air had become alive, charged with something dark and ancient. Emily closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the feeling grew stronger. Then, with a final, overwhelming surge of power, she felt it. A ripping sensation, as though something deep within her had been torn away. She cried out, but the sound was lost in the overwhelming chaos that surrounded her. And then, silence. The world around her had shifted. The veil had been torn open, and Emily stood at the center of it all, the ritual complete. But something was different. The air was still thick with power, but now there was an emptiness in it. An absence, as though something had been lost forever. The figure in the hood stood before her, watching her with an inscrutable expression. It is done, it said, its voice echoing in the stillness. The worlds are merging. The balance has been restored. Emily opened her eyes, her mind reeling from the sheer enormity of what she had just done. She had opened the gate. She had sacrificed her humanity. And now there was no turning back. But something was wrong. Sophie was gone. The twisted version of her, the one that had tormented Emily, had vanished. In its place, there was only an emptiness, a hollow, formless void. Emily took a step forward, her body trembling as she tried to process what had happened. The ritual was complete, but at what cost? What had she become? And what now? What would happen when the worlds fully merged? The silence that had settled after the ritual felt deafening. Emily's mind was a whirlwind of confusion, terror, and disbelief. The gate had opened, the worlds had merged, everything had changed. But now, standing in the aftermath of it all, she felt no sense of triumph, no sense of peace. Only the deep, gnawing fear that she had made a terrible mistake. Her body felt strange, almost foreign to her. She could feel the power within her, thrumming like an electric current, but it wasn't her own. It was something else, something ancient, something that shouldn't have been awakened. The world around her seemed warped, as if reality itself had fractured and was now holding on by the thinnest of threads. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It shifted and wavered as though the earth itself was struggling to hold its shape. She took a tentative step forward, her legs unsteady, and noticed that the air around her had grown heavy with an oppressive energy. The once crisp air now felt thick, suffocating. It pressed in on her from all sides as if it were trying to consume her whole. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself, the words barely audible above the pounding of her heart. She could still feel the presence of the figure in the hood, looming in the shadows, watching her with eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. But when she turned to face it, the figure was gone. In its place stood only the void, the darkness that had swallowed the space around her. She reached out, her fingers trembling, but there was nothing there. No one. Only the empty, endless abyss. And yet, she knew she was not alone. The whispers had started again. Quiet at first, just a faint murmur on the edge of her hearing. But they were growing louder now, their words indistinct but filled with malice. Emily's pulse quickened as she tried to focus, tried to make sense of the sound. But it was as if the very air had become alive with voices, each one jarring and inhuman. Her mind raced. Had she truly opened the gate? Was this what the figure had meant when it spoke of balance? Or had she done something far worse? Had she unleashed something that should never have been released? The shadows around her seemed to pulse in response to her thoughts, as though they were listening, waiting for her to make the next move. Emily felt a surge of panic. She had to understand what had happened, but there were no answers, no explanations. Only the dark, oppressive silence that surrounded her. She stumbled forward, the ground beneath her shifting with every step. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until they were no longer just murmurs. They were voices. Many voices. Each one twisted, distorted, filled with anger, pain, and hunger. "Emily," one voice hissed, its tone cold and twisted. "You have opened the way. You have brought us through." Emily froze, her heart lurching in her chest. The voice wasn't familiar, but it carried a weight of something she couldn't understand. A presence that seemed to crawl under her skin, its very essence unsettling and wrong. "You can't stop it now," another voice crooned, a laugh echoing through the air. "The worlds are one, and there is no turning back." She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin as the realization hit her. This wasn't just about the merging of worlds. This was something far worse. The very fabric of existence was being torn apart, and she was at the center of it. She had opened the gate, but now, it was as though she had invited something into her world, something that didn't belong. And now that something was coming for her. She turned frantically, looking for any sign of escape, but the darkness closed in from all sides. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they were all becoming one with the shadows. The air was thick with an oppressive force that seemed to suffocate her every breath. Suddenly, a figure materialized in front of her, its form shifting in and out of focus, like a mirage. It was a man, or at least it had once been a man. His face was pale, his features twisted and distorted, his eyes hollow and empty. He reached out toward her, his fingers elongated and unnatural, as though he were part of the very darkness itself. "You are the key," the figure said, its voice low and guttural. "You have opened the door. Now you must take the final step." Emily recoiled, her instincts screaming for her to run. But there was nowhere to run. The space around her had become a swirling mass of shadows and flickering lights, as though reality itself was breaking down. The figure reached out, its hand cold and unfeeling, and Emily felt a chill run through her entire body. "No," she cried, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. "I didn't mean to do this. I didn't mean to open anything." The figure's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You didn't have a choice," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You were always meant to be the one to open the gate, to bring us through." Emily's mind spun. This was the sacrifice. This was the price she had paid for her mistake. She had opened the gate, and now she was trapped in whatever nightmare it had unleashed. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. She tried to push the figure away, but her hands passed right through it as though it wasn't even there. The darkness around her seemed to close in, pressing against her, suffocating her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were all speaking directly to her. "You can't escape," one voice said. "You are ours now." "You opened the way," another whispered, its tone sweet and seductive. "Now you will pay the price." Emily's knees buckled beneath her as the weight of their words crashed down on her. She felt the ground beneath her shift again, as though the very earth was collapsing in on itself. Her vision blurred as the darkness seemed to swallow her whole, until there was nothing left but the cold, suffocating void. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. Emily blinked, her mind disoriented. She was no longer in the cavern, no longer surrounded by the darkness. The whispers had stopped. The weight of the power that had been pressing against her was gone. She was back in the room, the familiar walls around her. But something was wrong. Everything felt off. The air was too still, too quiet. She looked down at her hands, feeling a strange, unsettling sensation ripple through her. The power that had surged within her was gone, but it had left something behind. A feeling, a mark. Something dark, something twisted that she couldn't understand. She turned to the door, her heart pounding. Was this it? Was this the end of the world she knew? Had she really caused the merging of worlds, or was it just the beginning? Whatever it was, she knew she would never be the same. The world would never be the same. There was no going back. Story 2. The knock on the door came at 3:07 a.m., sharp and deliberate, as if whoever stood on the other side knew she was awake. Emma froze mid-step, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't spoken to anyone since moving into this apartment 2 weeks ago. She wasn't expecting visitors, especially not in the dead of night. The knock came again, this time louder. Her heart raced as she tiptoed toward the door. She didn't turn on any lights, afraid that even the faintest glow would signal she was home. When she reached the peephole, her trembling hand hovered over the door, debating whether to look. The hallway light outside flickered ominously. Taking a deep breath, she pressed her eye against the peephole. There was no one there. Emma stepped back, her pulse pounding in her ears. Just as she started to convince herself it was a prank, or maybe a figment of her imagination, her phone buzzed on the counter. The sudden vibration made her jump. She grabbed it hesitantly. Unknown number, you're awake. Answer the door. She felt her blood run cold. The words were simple but terrifying. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old complex, and she hadn't given her number to anyone since moving here. She stared at the message, her mind scrambling for explanations. Another knock, this time louder and more insistent. It reverberated through the thin walls, making the air feel suffocating. With shaking hands, she typed out a reply. Who is this? A reply came instantly, as if whoever it was had been waiting for her to ask. Unknown number. You shouldn't have opened the box. Her stomach dropped. The box. She glanced toward the corner of the living room, where a small, unmarked cardboard box sat innocently among her moving supplies. It had arrived the day before, with no return address or sender information. She had thought it was a mistake, but curiosity had gotten the better of her. Inside, she had found a stack of photographs and a single key. The photos were strange, blurry images of people she didn't recognize, all taken in what appeared to be this very apartment. The key was old and tarnished, but she hadn't figured out what it unlocked. The knock came again, this time with a force that rattled the door. Who's there? She called out, her voice shaking. Silence. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number, they're inside now. The message made her legs buckle. She turned to look behind her, every shadow in the apartment suddenly menacing. The room felt colder, the air heavy. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and held it like a weapon as she scanned the apartment. The shadows didn't move, but something felt wrong, as though the space wasn't entirely hers anymore. She tried to call the police, but her phone screen froze. It flickered and went black, leaving her staring at her own pale reflection. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. The silence was so thick it felt alive. And then she heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from her bedroom. Emma's feet refused to move. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body was locked in place. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like nails on wood, slow and unrelenting. Who's there? She managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The scraping stopped. A low, raspy whisper came from the direction of her bedroom. You opened the box. Emma's vision blurred with tears. The voice wasn't human, it was layered, distorted, as if multiple people were speaking at once. She took a step back, gripping the lamp tighter. I don't know what you want. Leave me alone. The whisper turned into a chilling laugh, echoing through the apartment. Too late. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, stretching toward her like claws. The temperature dropped further, and her breath came out in visible puffs. Suddenly, the scraping started again, but this time it was closer, right outside her bedroom door. Emma felt her knees buckle as a shape began to emerge from the shadows. It was tall, hunched, and its movements were unnaturally jerky, like a puppet on tangled strings. She screamed and swung the lamp, but it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The creature tilted its head, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "You shouldn't have opened the box," it said again, its voice now inside her head. Emma turned and ran for the front door, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. She fumbled with the lock, her shaking hands unable to turn the deadbolt. Behind her, the scraping grew louder, faster, as if the creature was closing the distance. Finally, she managed to unlock the door and burst into the hallway. The flickering light above cast eerie shadows that seemed to follow her as she sprinted toward the stairwell. But when she reached the stairs, she froze. Standing at the bottom, blocking her only exit, was another figure. This one was taller, its face obscured by a veil of darkness that seemed to pulse like a living thing. Emma backed away slowly, her mind screaming for a way out. She turned to head back to her apartment, but the door slammed shut on its own. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number, there's no escaping now. Emma's scream echoed through the empty stairwell as the lights flickered one last time and went out. The darkness in the stairwell was absolute, the kind that swallowed every glimmer of light and sound, leaving Emma feeling like she had been thrust into a void. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, the sound bouncing off unseen walls. She pressed her back against the cold concrete, clutching her useless phone as though it might suddenly save her. The silence didn't last. A low, guttural growl rose from the base of the stairs, the sound vibrating through the air and into her chest. It wasn't human, too deep, too unnatural. Her knees threatened to give out, but she forced herself to stay upright. "Who are you?" she shouted into the abyss, her voice trembling. The only response was the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the stairs. They were heavy, each one echoing ominously as they climbed toward her. Emma's hands scrambled along the wall, desperate to find a light switch or something to cling to, but the darkness was unforgiving. She could feel the icy concrete under her fingers, but no switch, no escape. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Her mind raced. She couldn't go down, the creature was there. She couldn't go back. Her apartment door had slammed shut, locking her out. That left one option: up. Without thinking, she bolted for the next flight of stairs. Her footsteps were frantic, echoing wildly as she climbed, but the thing below didn't quicken its pace. Its steady, relentless approach was somehow worse, like it knew she couldn't outrun it. By the time she reached the next landing, her legs were shaking and her lungs burned. She glanced over the railing, hoping to catch a glimpse of her pursuer, but the stairwell below was still shrouded in impenetrable darkness. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again, the sudden vibration making her cry out. With trembling hands, she pulled it out and looked at the screen. "Unknown number, why are you running?" She bit back a scream, her fingers tightening around the phone. She wanted to throw it away, to smash it, but she couldn't. It was her only connection to whatever this was. Another message appeared. "Unknown number, you can't run from what's already inside you." Inside her? Her breath hitched as fear clawed its way up her throat. She shoved the phone back into her pocket and kept climbing, her feet barely touching the steps. When she reached the top of the stairwell, she was met with a heavy metal door. It was the kind that led to the roof, marked with peeling red letters that read "Emergency Exit." She grabbed the handle and pushed, but it didn't budge. "No, no, no," she whispered, banging on the door with both fists. "Please?" A sudden sound froze her in place, a wet, slithering noise like something dragging across the floor. She turned slowly, her back pressed against the unyielding door. The hallway behind her was empty, but the sound continued, growing louder, closer. Emma's chest heaved as panic consumed her. She pushed against the door again, this time with all her strength, and to her surprise, it swung open. The freezing night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't hesitate. She stumbled onto the roof, slamming the door shut behind her. For a moment, she stood there, gasping for air, her eyes darting around the rooftop. The city stretched out before her, its lights glittering like stars, but it felt distant, disconnected from her reality. The wind howled, carrying with it an unnatural whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Emma? Her name, carried on the wind, sent shivers down her spine. She turned in a slow circle, searching for the source, but the rooftop was empty. Emma? The whisper came again, louder this time, and she realized with horror that it wasn't coming from the wind. It was inside her head. She clutched her temples, her knees buckling under the weight of the voice. "Stop it," she screamed. "Leave me alone." The laughter returned, echoing in her mind, growing louder and more distorted until it felt like her skull would split. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Emma opened her eyes, her vision blurred by tears. The rooftop was still empty, but something felt wrong. The air was heavier, thicker, and the city lights seemed dimmer, as though a veil had been drawn over the world. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but her hand moved on its own, pulling it from her pocket. "Unknown number, look behind you." Her breath caught in her throat. Every nerve in her body screamed at her not to turn around, but she couldn't stop herself. Slowly, she twisted her head, her eyes widening as she saw the door she had just come through. It was wide open. Standing in the doorway was the figure from the stairs, its form now clearer in the moonlight. Its body was twisted and wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its hollow eyes bore into hers, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. "Emma," it said, its voice a guttural growl that made her stomach churn. She stumbled backward, nearly losing her footing as the creature stepped onto the rooftop. Its movements were slow but deliberate, each step making her chest tighten with dread. "What do you want from me?" she screamed, her voice cracking. The creature tilted its head further, its smile widening. "You opened the box. Now you belong to us." "Us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The creature raised a hand, pointing toward the edge of the roof. Emma's gaze followed, and her blood ran cold. There, standing along the edge like sentinels, were more figures. They were motionless, their faces obscured by shadows, but she could feel their eyes on her. Her phone buzzed one last time. "Unknown number, jump." Her scream echoed into the night. Emma's scream faded into the cold night air, but the figures along the rooftop remained unmoving, their silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed away from the edge, the icy wind stinging her face. She clutched her phone tightly, hoping against reason that there was a way out of this. Her gaze darted to the door, but the twisted figure stood blocking it, its grotesque smile stretching wider as it tilted its head to the other side. "Why are you doing this to me?" she choked out, her voice trembling. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it raised one spindly arm and pointed toward the edge again. The message was clear. "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not doing that. I don't care what you want. I'm not jumping." The creature's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by something worse. Its hollow eyes seemed to darken, and its body twitched violently, as though it was straining against invisible strings. The figures along the edge turned their heads toward her in unison, the sudden motion so synchronized it made her stomach churn. Emma's phone buzzed in her hand, the screen lighting up with a new message. "Unknown number, you don't have a choice." Her fingers hovered over the screen, unsure whether to reply or throw the phone off the roof. She took a shaky step back, keeping her eyes on the figure by the door. "I'm not playing your game," she said louder this time. "Whatever this is, it ends here." Move, but their presence was suffocating, their silent watchfulness pressing down on her like a weight. When she was only a few feet from the mass, it stopped shifting. The tendrils froze mid-air, the eyes along its surface snapping open and fixing on her. "Emma?" The voice was everywhere at once, booming and whispering in her ears, in her mind, in her very soul. It wasn't the voice of the creature from the rooftop, it was something older, deeper, and infinitely more terrifying. "Why me?" she choked out, tears streaming down her face. The mass didn't answer with words. Instead, one of its tendrils extended toward her, stopping just inches from her chest. It hovered there for a moment before piercing her skin. Emma screamed as pain ripped through her body, white-hot and unbearable. She fell to her knees, clutching at the tendril, but it was no use. It burrowed deeper, and with it came visions, flashes of memories that weren't hers. She saw a man in a dark room, his hands trembling as he opened the same box she had found. He screamed as shadows engulfed him. She saw a woman running through a forest, the box clutched to her chest. The trees seemed alive, their branches clawing at her as she stumbled. She saw a child sitting in a dimly lit room, the box sitting unopened on the floor. The child's face was blank, their eyes wide with fear. Then she saw herself. She was back in her apartment, staring out the window. But this time the reflection was clearer. The creature's face wasn't just behind hers, It was hers. The tendril withdrew, leaving her gasping for air. Her chest ached where it had pierced her, and when she looked down, she saw a mark etched into her skin. It was the same symbol that had been on the second door, the circle with jagged lines radiating outward. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. The mass pulsed, its tendrils twitching. "A key," it said, its voice resonating through her. "You are the doorway." Emma's heart sank. The doorway to what? The figures around her began to hum again, their voices low and haunting. The mass started to shift once more, its form becoming more chaotic. "To the end," it replied. The room began to shake, the walls cracking and the floor splitting open. A deep, red light poured out from the fissures, illuminating the space in an otherworldly glow. Emma stumbled backward, her hands clutching the mark on her chest. She could feel it burning, as if something inside her was trying to escape. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This isn't happening. This can't be real." Her phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a single word. "Unknown number, run." The ground beneath her feet gave way and she fell into darkness. Emma plunged into the darkness, her screams swallowed by the void. The sensation of falling was endless, like the bottom would never arrive, as if she were being dragged deeper and deeper into something incomprehensible. The air around her was thick and cold, but it wasn't air at all. It felt alive, wrapping around her limbs and pulling her downward with invisible hands. When she finally hit the ground, the impact stole the breath from her lungs. The surface was soft yet unyielding, like damp soil mixed with something viscous. For a moment, she lay there, too stunned to move, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, if it could be called light at all. It was more like the absence of darkness, a faint, pulsing glow that seemed to come from the very ground she lay on. She pushed herself up, her hands sinking slightly into the strange surface. The air smelled of rotten metal, and every breath burned her throat. Around her, the space stretched infinitely in all directions, filled with a low, humming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't a noise so much as a feeling, pressing against her skull and rattling her thoughts. She stood on unsteady legs, brushing the dirt from her jeans, though it left an oily residue on her hands. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. One moment she'd been on the rooftop, then in that horrifying room with the pulsating mass. Now she was, where? "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum. The mark on her chest burned, a sharp, searing pain that made her wince. She pulled her shirt down to look at it. The symbol glowed faintly, its lines pulsing in rhythm with the vibration around her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fumbled for it, her hands slick and trembling. "Unknown number, keep moving." "What do you mean?" she yelled at the screen. "What is this place?" The phone buzzed again, this time with a new message. "Unknown number, don't stop. It knows you're here." A chill ran down her spine. "What knows I'm here?" she whispered. The vibration grew louder, the ground beneath her feet trembling slightly. She glanced around, her eyes darting to the horizon, or what passed for a horizon in this strange place. The glow seemed to intensify in one direction, and with it came a faint sound, like the distant echo of footsteps. No, not footsteps. Something heavier. Her instinct screamed at her to run, and this time she listened. She took off in the opposite direction, her feet sinking slightly with each step. The ground seemed to resist her, clinging to her shoes and slowing her down, but she pushed forward, adrenaline driving her forward. Behind her, the sound grew louder. It wasn't footsteps. It was more like a slithering, a dragging noise that sent shivers down her spine. Whatever was following her wasn't human. "Keep moving," she muttered to herself, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Don't stop. Don't look back." The hum around her grew sharper, almost painful, as if the air itself was vibrating. She stumbled, falling to her hands and knees. The oily ground clung to her skin, but she forced herself up, ignoring the sting of the mark on her chest. Her phone buzzed again and she pulled it out without stopping. "Unknown number, it's closer than you think." Emma's blood ran cold. She risked a glance over her shoulder, and immediately wished she hadn't. The thing pursuing her was massive, its form shifting and writhing like the pulsating mass she'd seen earlier. But this was different. It had a shape, a terrible crawling shape with too many limbs and too many eyes. Its body was a patchwork of flesh and shadow, constantly twisting as it moved. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. The ground beneath it seemed to pull it forward, dragging it closer and closer to her. She turned and ran faster, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The glow in the distance grew brighter, and with it came a strange sound, a low melodic hum that seemed to cut through the vibration in the air. "Keep going," she told herself, her voice shaking. "You have to keep going." As she ran, the ground began to change beneath her feet. The oily surface gave way to something firmer, almost like stone, though it was slick and uneven. The glow ahead of her grew stronger, taking on a bluish hue. She reached the source of the light and skidded to a stop. Before her was a massive chasm, its edges jagged and sharp. The glow came from deep within, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that seemed to pulse with life. Her phone buzzed again. "Unknown number, jump." "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, I'm not doing that." Behind her, the creature let out a guttural roar that shook the ground. The sound was deafening, primal, and filled with rage. The mark on her chest burned hotter, the pain radiating through her body. She dropped to her knees, clutching at it as tears streamed down her face. "Why is this happening to me?" she screamed, her voice cracking. The roar came again, closer this time. She turned her head just enough to see the creature looming over her, its many eyes glowing with malevolence. Her phone buzzed once more. "Unknown number, this is the only way." She looked at the chasm, then back at the creature. She didn't have a choice. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she stood and stepped to the edge. The vortex seemed to reach out to her, its light intensifying. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she jumped. Emma's body was weightless as she fell, spiraling through the cold air. Her stomach lurched, a sensation like she was plummeting into nothingness, the world around her shifting between blinding flashes of light and swirling shadows. The glow from the chasm above her became a distant memory, swallowed by the blackness that surrounded her. The force of her fall was dizzying, her mind struggling to process anything as she tumbled through the void. Time seemed to stretch out endlessly. Was she falling for seconds? Minutes? Hours? The sensation of falling had become a constant hum, a vibration deep in her bones. She gasped for air that wasn't there, her lungs seizing in the emptiness, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. Emma crashed onto a solid surface with a force that knocked the wind out of her. She lay there for a moment, disoriented, her body screaming in pain from the impact. Her hands pressed against the cold, hard ground, and she struggled to push herself up. When she finally managed to sit up, she looked around, only to be met with an overwhelming sight that nearly made her wish she had stayed on the ground. Before her stood a massive, twisted structure, a dark, jagged spire that seemed to pierce the very sky. It was made of the same black stone she had seen in the chamber before, but this time the stone was covered in what looked like ancient symbols, etched deeply into its surface. The spire loomed high above her, its peak lost in a haze of mist and darkness. The air here was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on her. The ground beneath her was uneven, covered in cracks that seemed to pulse with a faint, red light. The entire place felt wrong, unnatural. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady from the fall. She had no idea where she was or how to get back, but something deep inside her told her that she couldn't afford to stay still. Whatever was chasing her had to be close by, and whatever was happening to her, to this place, it was only going to get worse. Emma took a tentative step forward, her feet making a soft, echoing sound as they met the cracked ground. The air smelled of sulfur, sharp and acrid, burning her nostrils with every breath. The strange hum from before was gone, but now there was a low, throbbing pulse that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. As she walked, the feeling of being watched began to grow. She wasn't alone. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, her senses tingling with fear. She quickened her pace, moving toward the spire in the distance, though she had no idea what she was going to find there. The weight in the air grew thicker, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on her from all sides. Every step felt like it took her deeper into some kind of nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She passed strange, twisted pillars that rose from the ground like trees, their bark slick and black, covered in what looked like veins of glowing red light. The closer she got to the spire, the stronger the pull became. Something was calling to her from within it, something ancient, something far beyond her understanding. It wasn't until she reached the base of the spire that she realized just how massive it truly was. The walls of the structure were covered in hundreds, maybe thousands, of the same symbols she had seen earlier. Some were faded as if time had worn them away, but others glowed faintly, their lines shifting like they were alive. Without thinking, she reached out to touch one. The moment her fingers made contact with the stone, the ground trembled beneath her feet. The pulse in the air became stronger, faster, like a heartbeat that had grown erratic. She stepped back, heart racing, unsure of what she had done. A voice, deep and guttural, suddenly echoed from somewhere above her. "You shouldn't have touched it." Emma spun around, her heart slamming against her chest. She saw no one, only the empty, dark sky above her and the blackened ground stretching out for miles. The voice, though, was unmistakable. It had come from inside the spire. The voice grew louder, clearer, until it felt like it was inside her head, reverberating through her very thoughts. "It's too late now," the voice continued. "You've crossed the threshold." She took a step back, her mind racing. What did that mean? What threshold? Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet split open with a deafening crack. Emma gasped, stumbling back as a massive blackened tendril shot up from the crevice, curling around her ankle and pulling her toward the spire. "No!" she screamed, trying to yank herself free. But the tendril was too strong, its grip tightening with every desperate pull she made. She twisted and turned, but the tendril only tightened, pulling her closer to the base of the spire. As she struggled, the voice spoke again, this time not just in her mind but out loud, reverberating through the air. "You cannot escape now. You are part of this." The tendril lifted her off the ground, and she screamed, kicking and flailing as it dragged her closer to the spire's dark, gaping entrance. She tried to fight it, but the tendril only pulled harder, pulling her into the darkness. As she was dragged through the opening, she saw a horrible sight that stopped her breath cold. At the center of the spire was a massive, pulsating mass of black and red, shifting in and out of shape. It was as though the spire itself was alive, its heart beating with the same pulse she had felt in the air. The tendril flung her toward it, and she hit the ground with a painful thud. Her body felt heavy, as though the weight of the place was pressing down on her. She tried to push herself up, but the air was thick with an unseen force, keeping her rooted to the spot. The voice spoke again, now so close it felt like it was in her ear. "You've come to the end. You will serve us now." Emma's blood ran cold as the mass before her began to shift and morph, taking form. Something more than a shadow, something ancient, something hungry. Her mind raced. There had to be a way out. She couldn't stay here. The mark on her chest burned brighter than ever before, and she realized with horror that the symbol had begun to move. It twisted and shifted, its lines forming shapes, like it was trying to tell her something. She reached for the mark, her fingers trembling. As her hand made contact with the glowing symbol, the ground shook violently, and the spire seemed to tremble with rage. Something had changed, but she didn't know what it meant. "Get up," she whispered to herself. "You have to move. You have to." But before she could finish her thought, the voice came again, this time more forceful than before. "You cannot run from us." The world around her began to blur, the darkness closing in as the creatures stirred, their glowing eyes fixed on her. Emma didn't have time to react before the world around her went black. Emma awoke with a start, gasping for breath, her chest heaving as though she had just been running for her life. Her body trembled, a cold sweat slicking her skin as she scanned her surroundings. The world around her was blurry at first, but as her vision cleared, she realized that she was no longer in the spire, or anywhere she recognized. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional crackling of distant, unseen forces. She was lying on a smooth, cold surface, her body stiff from the fall. The ground beneath her was metallic, almost like cold, polished stone, and her senses were overwhelmed by the oppressive stillness. It was as though the very atmosphere had been drained of life. She pushed herself up slowly, her mind struggling to process what had happened. She had fallen, yes, but had she passed out after being dragged into the spire? Had that horrifying entity done something to her? The last thing she remembered was the sound of the tendril's grip tightening, the heavy darkness swallowing her whole. And yet here she was. She looked around, still groggy, but now her senses sharpened with the urgency that had been growing within her. There were no creatures in sight, but she felt their presence, their eerie gaze upon her, like shadows lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Emma stood up, her knees buckling momentarily from the sudden movement. She steadied herself against the wall, trying to focus. The walls were lined with what appeared to be thin strips of metal, dark and smooth, glowing faintly with an unearthly light. The dim glow illuminated the surroundings in a way that made everything look wrong. The edges of the walls were jagged, as if they were purposefully designed to keep something in, or perhaps to keep something out. "What is this place?" she muttered, her voice hoarse. She turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of her environment. The place felt like a labyrinth, like a prison, though she could sense no bars or doors. She only felt the crushing weight of the silence, the kind that gnawed at your sanity. A sudden whisper echoed in the distance, too faint for her to make out, but it was enough to send a cold shiver running down her spine. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was so soft, but it felt like it was coming from all around her, as if the walls themselves were alive, whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. Another whisper, louder this time. She could almost make out a word. "Emma?" Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't imagining it. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice louder than it had been before. Her words seemed to dissolve into the thick air, swallowed by the emptiness around her. There was no response, only the hollow echo of her own voice. She stumbled forward, the urge to run pulling at her. But where? Where could she go in this suffocating space? The whispers were gone, leaving her with the oppressive silence once more. She kept moving, her footsteps echoing as she searched for any sign of life, anything that could help her understand where she was, or if she was even still alive. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. After what felt like hours of walking, Emma came to an intersection, a fork in the path that seemed to split the world into two opposing directions. One path led into a deeper darkness, while the other was faintly illuminated by a soft, bluish glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her racing heartbeat. Her instincts screamed at her to go the way of the light, to follow the pulse that seemed to call to her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was waiting for her on the other path. The whispers returned. "Don't go that way." The voice was distant but unmistakable. Emma's breath hitched. She glanced down the dark path, then at the glowing one. She wanted to follow the light, to escape the unnerving weight of the darkness, but she couldn't ignore the voice. Slowly she stepped toward the dark path. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, as if the very air was thickening, resisting her movement. But she couldn't turn back now. She had to know what lay ahead, even if the fear clawed at her chest. The further she walked, the thicker the darkness became, until she could barely see her own hands in front of her face. It was as if the very air had become impenetrable, a dense fog of shadows that blurred the edges of reality. She couldn't shake the sensation that the darkness was closing in on her, that it was trying to consume her, devour her whole. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the wall, and a sudden surge of energy shot through her, freezing her in place. The wall had become unnaturally cold, colder than any ice she had ever felt. She jerked her hand back, and for a split second, the shadows flickered as if they were alive. Her heart pounded as she took another step. The air around her grew colder still, the temperature dropping with each passing second. Then a soft sound, a soft scurrying, echoed through the hallway. The sound of something moving, something small and fast, skittering in the darkness. Emma's breath hitched. She had been alone, hadn't she? The scurrying sound grew louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from every direction. She pressed her back against the wall, her hands clammy with sweat as she scanned the pitch-black hallway. Then she saw it, two glowing eyes. They glowed a sickly yellow, cutting through the darkness like twin headlights. The eyes blinked, and the creature they belonged to emerged from the shadows, crawling along the walls with an unnatural grace. It was humanoid, but its skin was a slick, translucent white, stretched tight over jagged bones. Its limbs were long and thin, too long for its body, ending in sharp, clawed fingers that scraped against the walls as it moved. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and it let out a low, guttural hiss. Emma stumbled back, but the creature didn't move. It merely stared at her, its glowing eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Suddenly, the creature's head jerked to the side, as if listening to something Emma couldn't hear. Then it hissed again and crawled deeper into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Emma's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she stood there, too stunned to move. Her legs felt weak, and her mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. What was that thing? She didn't have time to wonder. The voice echoed in her mind again, clearer now, more urgent. "Run, Emma." The whisper was so soft, so close, but it wasn't just the voice she had heard before. This time there was something different about it, something familiar. It was almost like someone she knew was speaking to her. But who? Emma turned on her heel and ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay here any longer. She had to get away from whatever that thing was, and she had to find out what was happening to her. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness, the walls pressing in on her from all sides. She wasn't alone. She could feel the presence of something, someone, lurking in the dark. The air grew colder still, and Emma's vision began to blur. She was close, she was almost there, but to what? What would she find at the end of this twisted maze? And what did it all mean? The question burned in her mind as she pushed herself harder, the fear driving her forward. The cold air wrapped around Emma like a suffocating cloak, its icy grip pulling at her breath. Each step she took felt heavier, the weight of the place pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She ran blindly, her legs aching, her mind racing with 100 questions, none of which had answers. The distant hum of the strange energy pulsed beneath her feet, vibrating through the ground like a heartbeat. The sound was growing louder, faster, closer. There had to be something, some escape, some way out of this madness. Her footsteps echoed down the seemingly endless hallway, the sound reverberating off the dark walls. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to move, had to get away from whatever that creature was, and whatever else was waiting in the shadows. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it, the presence. It was there, lurking just out of sight. She could sense its eyes on her, as though it was waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, a loud screech pierced the air, followed by the sound of something scuttling across the floor behind her. Emma's blood ran cold as her heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to turn around to know that something was there. The creature was following her. She could hear its claws scraping against the cold metal floor, its breath hot and ragged in the darkness. It was getting closer. The walls seemed to close in around her, narrowing the space as though the labyrinth itself was shifting, reshaping to trap her. Panic gripped her chest, and her legs moved faster, pushing her forward with a desperate urgency. She wasn't sure if she was still in the same place anymore, or if the passageways had changed. It felt like the world around her was shifting, stretching, warping into something unrecognizable. Then ahead she saw it. A door. It was small, barely visible in the darkness, but it was there. A way out. She pushed herself harder, her feet pounding the cold ground as she sprinted toward it. The door loomed closer, and with a burst of energy she reached it, throwing her shoulder into it with all her strength. It creaked open slowly, but just enough for her to slip through. The moment she was inside, she slammed it shut behind her, her breath coming in jagged gasps as she leaned against it, trying to steady herself. She was safe, at least for the moment. But she couldn't rest. Not yet. The room she had entered was smaller than the hallways, but it was no less strange. The walls were covered in strange, shifting symbols, glowing faintly with an eerie, pulsating light. The floor beneath her feet felt soft, as though she was standing on a surface that wasn't solid, yet it held her weight without issue. It was as though the entire room was alive, reacting to her presence. Emma's eyes darted around the space, trying to make sense of it. The room was circular, its ceiling disappearing into an impenetrable darkness above. The air was thick with a strange energy, crackling and sparking as if something was just waiting to be unleashed. Then something caught her eye. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, glowing faintly, with a small, intricately carved stone resting on top. It looked out of place here, as if it didn't belong among the strange, living walls and the pulsing energy. Emma felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a compulsion that was both frightening and familiar. She couldn't explain it, but something about the stone called to her. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she moved toward the pedestal. Her heart thudded in her chest as she reached out and touched the stone. The moment her fingers made contact, the room seemed to shudder, as if it had come to life. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the air crackled with static, sending a sharp, uncomfortable sensation through her fingertips. A voice, deep and resonant, filled her mind. "You shouldn't have done that." The words weren't spoken aloud, yet they rang in her ears like a command. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she recoiled from the stone, her hand pulling back as though it had been burned. But the stone remained where it was, silent, still. The voice, however, didn't leave. It lingered, like a presence in the back of her mind, a shadow that watched her every move. "You are bound to it now," the voice continued. "The stone is part of you, and you are part of it." Emma's head swam with confusion, her mind struggling to comprehend the words. Bound to it? What did that mean? What was this place? Before she could ask, a loud bang echoed from the door she had just come through. The sound was followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal, scratching, tapping, growing louder with each passing second. The creature was close, too close. Panic surged through Emma's body and she spun toward the door, her heart racing. She could feel the creature outside, its presence pressing against the very fabric of the room. There was no way out, no escape. Suddenly, the stone in her hand pulsed with energy. The glow from the symbols on the walls flared brighter, as if responding to the stone's power. Emma gasped as the stone's warmth spread through her fingertips, seeping into her skin like a surge of electricity. The pulse of energy began to grow stronger, until it felt as though the entire room was vibrating with it. The door shook violently, the claws from the other side scratching, scraping as if something was trying to break through. But Emma wasn't focused on that. The stone in her hand was calling to her, its energy flooding her body, filling her with something she couldn't explain, something dark, ancient, and powerful. And then she heard it, a voice not in her mind this time but in the air surrounding her. It was a whisper, soft but unmistakable. "You have no choice." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The voice had come from the stone, and the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Whatever this stone was, whatever it had done to her, she had just become part of something far larger than she could comprehend. Something that wanted her to stay. The creature outside the door growled, its breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps, its claws scraping against the door as though it were testing its strength. Emma looked at the stone in her hand, the pulsating light, the heat, and the energy flowing through her. She wasn't sure what was happening or what she had to do, but she knew one thing. Staying here, doing nothing, would only lead to her destruction. The stone was her only hope, or maybe her only damnation. With one final glance at the door, she pressed the stone to her chest. The moment she did, a violent surge of energy shot through her body, and the room seemed to implode around her, the walls crumbling, the floor dissolving beneath her feet. She was falling again, deeper this time, swallowed by a blackness that was colder than anything she had felt before. Emma's last thought as she fell was a single question. What had she just unleashed? Emma's body slammed into the ground with an unearthly force, sending shockwaves of pain through every part of her. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, just darkness. And then, slowly, her senses returned, like fragments of a shattered mirror coming back together. The sharp, stinging pain in her ribs, the coldness of the stone beneath her, the weight of the air pressing in around her. She forced her eyes open, blinking rapidly against the fog that clouded her mind. The world around her was not the same as before. She was no longer in the strange room with the glowing stone, no longer surrounded by walls covered in shifting symbols. She was somewhere else, a place that felt both eerily familiar and impossibly foreign at the same time. It was as though the very air had changed, thickened, becoming almost solid, like it was pressing down on her from all sides. Emma pushed herself up, her hands trembling as they made contact with the ground. She was still gripping the stone, its warmth pulsing against her chest as though it were alive. She looked around, her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline surging through her veins, desperate to make sense of what had happened. The ground beneath her was soft, almost like earth, but not quite. It had a strange, alien texture, slick and smooth, yet organic, like the surface of some massive creature's skin. She stood, her legs weak from the fall, but she forced herself upright, steadying herself as the world around her slowly came into focus. She was in what seemed to be a vast, open space. A cavern, perhaps? A massive underground room stretching far into the distance, its ceiling lost in shadow. The walls of the cavern were alive in a way that Emma couldn't comprehend. They pulsed, not with light, but with a strange energy that hummed softly beneath the surface, as if the very stones themselves were breathing. The air was thick with a heavy, damp scent like wet soil, but there was something else, something acrid, something unnatural, lurking beneath it. In the distance, Emma could hear a low, rhythmic noise. A thumping, almost like the beat of a drum, but deeper, more primal. It seemed to come from everywhere, reverberating through the cavern, shaking the very ground beneath her. Her heart raced, and every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, to get out, but she didn't know where to go. The stone pulsed in her chest, its heat growing more intense with each passing moment. Her breath hitched as she took a step forward, her eyes scanning the vast expanse around her. The shadows seemed to shift, undulating like something was moving within them. But there was nothing. Just the ever-present hum, the oppressive energy in the air. And then she saw it. A figure. A shadow standing just at the edge of her vision, barely perceptible but undeniably there. It was tall, its outline warped and twisted, like it didn't quite belong to this world. Emma's pulse quickened as she stepped back, her breath coming faster. She couldn't make out any details, but she felt the weight of its gaze on her, cold and suffocating. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, its presence like a black hole in the fabric of reality, pulling her attention toward it. Emma's heart thudded in her chest as the air around her seemed to grow even heavier. Her body stiffened as the figure slowly began to materialize, the darkness around it shifting like smoke. Who are you?" Emma called out, her voice shaky, barely louder than a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It didn't speak, didn't even twitch. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the pulsating walls of the cavern, watching her with an intensity that felt like it was tearing through her soul. Then, in a flash of motion, it moved. Emma barely had time to react before the creature lunged toward her, its form moving with a terrifying speed. She stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat, but the stone at her chest flared with an intense heat, a sudden surge of power that pushed against the creature, forcing it back. The energy that pulsed from the stone rippled through the air, momentarily shattering the silence and sending a shockwave through the cavern. For a moment, everything went still. Emma stood frozen, her chest heaving with the effort to breathe, her hands still clutching the stone. The creature had recoiled, its form shifting like liquid as though it was made of darkness itself, but now it was just beyond her reach. Emma didn't know what had just happened, didn't understand why the stone had reacted that way, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. The figure's eyes, or what she thought were its eyes, gleamed from within the shadows, two glowing orbs that locked onto her with an intensity that made her feel as if her very soul was being scrutinized. She felt the weight of its gaze deep inside her chest, as if it were peeling away her thoughts, her memories, searching for something. A voice, distant and cold, echoed through her mind. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it was as clear as if it were. "Do you know what you've done?" Emma staggered backward, her mind spinning. Her hand gripped the stone tighter as the pulse within it grew stronger, louder, resonating with something deep within the cavern. She had no idea what was happening. What was this place? What was this creature? And why had she been brought here? The voice continued, this time more urgent, more insistent. "You should not have touched it. It binds you to this place. You will never leave. You will never escape." Emma shook her head, struggling to clear the fog in her mind. The creature was moving again, slow, deliberate steps toward her, its body flickering in and out of existence, as though it wasn't truly part of the physical world. Its presence was suffocating, its dark energy pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She didn't know what to do. The stone pulsed against her skin, its energy overwhelming her senses, but it didn't feel like it was helping. It felt like it was drawing her in, like it was feeding off her fear. The creature was getting closer, and there was no way out. "Help me," she whispered, though she knew no one could hear her. She didn't know if it was the stone or something else, but she felt the fear flooding her body, the realization that this place, this cavern, this entity, was beyond anything she could understand. And then, just as the creature was about to reach her, the stone flared with an immense light, blinding her for a moment. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to comprehend what was happening. A deafening roar filled the air, echoing from every corner of the cavern, and for a moment she thought she was going to be consumed by the darkness. But as the light faded, she opened her eyes to see the creature, no longer standing before her. It was gone. The cavern was silent once again. But Emma knew deep down this was far from over. Whatever had just happened, whatever force she had tapped into with the stone, it wasn't finished with her. And it was only a matter of time before it came for her again. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood in the cold, suffocating silence. She had no answers, no direction, and no way to stop what was coming next. All she could do was press forward into the unknown. What she didn't know was that with every step, she was walking deeper into the heart of the darkness. The silence in the cavern was absolute. It clung to Emma like a thick fog, suffocating her, pressing down on her chest with a weight that seemed almost physical. She stood in the center of the vast, empty space, still trembling from the encounter. Her heart pounded in her ears, each beat a reminder of how close she had come to being consumed by the creature, or whatever it had been. But now, in the eerie stillness, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The air around her felt charged, as if the cavern itself was holding its breath. Every step she took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness, the sound amplifying in the quiet, making her feel even more exposed, more vulnerable. She clutched the stone tightly, its warmth still radiating through her hand, a strange comfort in the midst of her fear. But now its glow was faint, like it was losing power, or perhaps it was her own strength that was failing. She didn't know what had happened when the stone had flared with that blinding light. She didn't understand why the creature had vanished. It had been so close. She could still feel its presence lingering in the shadows, its dark energy lingering like a heavy fog. But for now it was gone. For now. But Emma knew better than to think this was over. It never was. Nothing that had happened since she first touched the stone could be explained by logic, by reason. This place, these creatures, whatever she had awakened with her actions. Nothing made sense anymore. With a shaky breath, she forced herself to move, one foot in front of the other. She had no plan, no direction, but she couldn't stand still. Every instinct in her screamed to get out, to find an escape. But how could she? The cavern seemed endless, its walls shifting in the periphery of her vision, as though the very nature of the place was mutable, constantly changing. And the longer she stayed here, the more she felt it. This place wasn't just a prison. It was a living thing, a thing that fed off her fear, her uncertainty. The stone in her hand pulsed again, the warmth spreading through her palm and into her veins. It was stronger now, the energy crackling, and with it, a new sensation, an overwhelming compulsion. It wasn't just guiding her like a force pulling her toward something. It was driving her. Her mind was clouded, and the edges of her thoughts were fraying, slipping out of her control. She had no choice but to follow where it led, wherever that may be. She moved forward, her steps faltering at first, but then quicker, more desperate. The cavern stretched before her, its shadows deepening, its walls shifting and warping in unnatural ways. Every corner seemed to lead her deeper into the heart of the place, and yet she felt as though she were walking in circles. She couldn't be sure of anything. Nothing made sense here. Not the walls, not the sounds, not even the stone in her hand. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as the weight of the place pressed in on her. The darkness seemed to close in with each step, and the walls, once pulsing with energy, now felt cold, as though they had turned their backs on her. She could feel them watching, waiting, reacting to her presence. But to what end? Then she heard it, the soft whisper. Faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the air. It was a voice, but it was not a voice she could hear with her ears. It was inside her mind, whispering to her, wrapping itself around her thoughts like a tendril of smoke. Embrace it. The words were soft, seductive, and they twisted within her, tugging at the edges of her mind. Emma stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide, her pulse racing. She wasn't sure if it was the stone causing this, or if the cavern itself had started to speak to her. But whatever it was, it felt wrong. It felt like it was trying to take hold of her, to change her. She gripped the stone harder, the energy within it flaring as though in response to the voice. But the whisper persisted. You cannot escape. It is already inside you. The voice echoed in her mind, insistent, persistent. She wanted to scream, to push the words out of her head, but she couldn't. It was like the very air around her had become thick with these whispers, and they were filling every corner of her thoughts. She couldn't shut them out, couldn't focus. Her legs were weak. Her body was tired, worn down by the fear, by the uncertainty, by the terror of what was happening. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going, how much longer she could fight this force. It was everywhere, pressing on her from all sides. She stumbled forward, her legs shaking, the stone pulsing in her hand like a heartbeat. It was becoming unbearable. And then she saw it. In the distance, the faintest glimmer of light. She squinted through the darkness, unsure if it was real or just a figment of her imagination, but the closer she got, the clearer it became. The light was warm, not like the cold, eerie glow of the stone, but golden, like sunlight filtering through trees. It beckoned to her, a welcome respite from the darkness. Her heart surged with hope, a hope she hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. Maybe, just maybe, this was the way out. The light grew brighter as she drew closer, and she almost couldn't believe it. It felt real, felt safe. But as she stepped closer, the warmth of the light seemed to fade, replaced by a coldness that made her skin crawl. The golden glow flickered, like a candle struggling to stay lit in the wind. And the whispers came again, this time louder, more urgent. It is a trap. The words were clear now, not a whisper, but a shout in her mind, and Emma froze in place, her heart dropping into her stomach. She looked around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The light was no longer warm. It was cold, frozen. It was a lie, a deception, a cruel illusion. And then the shadow shifted. From the darkness surrounding her, something moved. Something massive, something ancient. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure emerged from the blackness, its form shifting and warping as though it was made of smoke, of shadows. But its eyes were unmistakable. Two glowing orbs, burning like twin stars in the dark. "You can never leave," the voice rumbled, low and deep, the words vibrating in her bones. "You belong here now." Emma stumbled backward, her heart racing, her body trembling with fear. The creature, the figure, loomed before her, its presence oppressive, its gaze unyielding. It wasn't just watching her anymore. It was inside her mind, inside her soul, and she could feel its grip tightening. Her hand was still clutching the stone, its energy pulsing with an intensity that burned her skin. The heat was unbearable now, and Emma knew that the stone was not just an object. It was a part of this place, a part of the darkness. She had awakened something that now had a claim on her. The creature moved closer, its form shifting with every step, like it wasn't bound by the same laws of reality that she was. It reached out, its hand, no, its claw, stretching toward her, and Emma could feel the coldness of its touch before it even made contact. "You are mine now," it whispered, and the world around her dissolved into darkness once again. Emma's world was consumed by darkness. At first, it was disorienting, an endless, formless void where nothing existed but the cold, the crushing silence, and the steady pulse of the stone against her chest. The cold wasn't just temperature, it was something deeper, a biting cold that seemed to seep into her very bones, gnawing away at her warmth and strength. It was as though the darkness had become a living thing, coiling around her, wrapping its tendrils around her soul, and squeezing with an unbearable pressure. She could feel it, could sense it, as though it was watching her from every angle, waiting for her to break. She didn't know how long she was suspended in this nothingness, this suffocating silence. Time lost all meaning in this place. There was no light, no sound, no motion. Just her, the stone, and the feeling of something ancient and unknowable pressing in on her from every direction. But then, just as she thought she might suffocate under the weight of it all, a faint shimmer appeared. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint flicker in the air like the reflection of light off water. But then it grew, slowly expanding, stretching outwards like an opening door, a portal. The shimmer became brighter, sharper, and the shadows that had surrounded her began to retract, slowly fading into the distance. She felt a strange pull in her chest, an inexplicable need to move toward the light. The stone pulsed in her hand, its warmth now searing against her skin, almost like it was alive, calling her forward. Before she could think, she was moving, her body responding before her mind could catch up. The shimmer grew larger as she stepped forward, like a rift in the fabric of the world itself. With every step she took, the cold receded, replaced by a warmth that felt comforting, like the first rays of sunlight after a storm. But just as quickly as the warmth had come, it faded again, replaced by a new sensation, this one darker, more suffocating. The shimmer expanded further until it became a massive, swirling vortex, its edges crackling with energy, but there was something wrong about it. The light within it pulsed in waves, chaotic and unsettling, and the closer Emma got, the more she felt as though it was consuming her, drawing her in against her will. The stone's energy intensified with each step she took, until the heat became unbearable, searing her hand. Emma gasped, her fingers trembling as she tried to hold on to it, but the energy surging from the stone was too much, too overwhelming. It was as if the stone itself was trying to break free from her grasp, pulling her toward the vortex with an unnatural force. "No!" she screamed, but the sound was lost in the void, swallowed by the overwhelming pull of the dark energy. She tried to resist, but it was no use. The stone in her hand seemed to vibrate with a life of its own, and with a final desperate cry, she was pulled forward into the vortex. Everything went white. She blinked rapidly, her head spinning as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Her body felt weightless, suspended in some undefined space, and for a moment she wondered if she had died. But then her vision cleared and she saw them. The walls around her were not made of stone anymore, but something else, something living. The walls shifted, pulsing in time with the beat of her heart, as though the very structure of this place was a part of her, tied to her existence. She stood in a vast chamber, but this was no ordinary chamber. It was a place that felt like it existed outside of time, beyond any logic or reason Emma had ever known. The air was thick, alive with a palpable energy, and the walls pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly glow. She could feel the energy in the air, taste it, almost as though it were a physical thing. And then, from the shadows, they appeared. Figures moving slowly, their forms indistinct at first, flickering like mirages, but as they drew nearer, they became clearer. Tall, elongated, their features obscured by darkness, but their presence undeniable. The air around them seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, and Emma felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. These weren't the creatures from the cavern, but something even older, more powerful, more terrifying. They moved silently, their forms gliding through the air, their faces hidden in shadow, but their eyes, Emma could feel their eyes. They were watching her, studying her with an intensity that sent waves of fear coursing through her. She wanted to look away, wanted to run, but something in her, something deep within, stopped her. The figure at the forefront of the group stepped forward, its movements graceful, fluid, and yet heavy with an authority that made Emma's heart race. It was tall, taller than any human had a right to be, and its shape seemed to flicker and distort with every movement, as if its form couldn't quite hold together. Its features were hidden, but the darkness surrounding it was thick, impenetrable, like it was a part of the very fabric of the space. One of the figures reached toward her, and Emma instinctively took a step back, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. She couldn't move. The figure's hand, its claw-like fingers, reached out, brushing against her skin. A cold, searing sensation shot through her, and her body spasmed with pain. She gasped, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts as the figure's touch seemed to drain her energy, leaving her weak, trembling. "Your time has come," the figure said, its voice low and rasping, like the sound of gravel being crushed beneath the weight of something massive. Emma's mind reeled, her vision blurring as the figure's words echoed through her head. What did it mean? What was happening to her? Why couldn't she fight back? The figure's hand moved away, and Emma felt the weight of the air shift, the energy around her pulsating with an intensity she had never felt before. It was as though the world itself was bending, shifting, reacting to her presence. The stone in her hand pulsed violently, and the figure's eyes, those dark, hollow orbs, fixed on it. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "You never could." A sickening wave of understanding washed over Emma, and she finally realized the truth of what had happened. The stone, this thing, had bound her to this place. It had led her here, to these creatures, to whatever nightmare she was now trapped in. She had thought she could control it, thought she could use it to escape, but she was wrong. She had become a part of this place, and now it was too late to turn back. With a sudden, overwhelming force, the figure reached for the stone, its clawed fingers closing around it. Emma screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the deafening hum of the cavern, the darkness closing in around her like a living thing. The stone pulsed once more, its energy flaring before it went completely still. Its warmth faded, and in its place, a cold emptiness filled her chest. "Now," the figure whispered, its voice like the wind howling through the void, "you will be ours." And with those words, Emma's world went black. When Emma opened her eyes, she wasn't sure where she was. Or rather, she wasn't sure if she even was anywhere. The void was still around her, its oppressive silence louder than any noise she had ever heard. But this time it was different. This time there was something new, something in the air, something alive. The shadows stretched out in every direction, twisting and contorting like sentient beings, their dark forms moving with a purpose. The walls of this place weren't walls at all. Instead, they were pulsating, shifting, their surfaces constantly changing, as if the very nature of the space was being rewritten before her eyes. The space itself was alive, breathing, and it seemed to recognize her presence. Emma tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. She couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet, but she was aware of it, aware that she was standing on something solid. The air was thick with an energy she couldn't explain, an energy that made every breath feel like she was suffocating. The stone in her hand was cold now, its once warm glow having dimmed to nothing more than a faint pulse. But even in her disorientation, there was one thing she knew: she was not alone. From the corners of her vision, she could feel them. The figures, the ones she had seen before. No, not just seen, felt. They were here in this strange dimension watching her. But now they were not the same as before. They had grown bolder, more tangible, their forms clearer, more solid. Their eyes glowed in the dimness, the light burning through the shadows, pinpricks of light that seemed to follow her every move. And then, from the depths of the shadows, they spoke. "You are weak." The voice was not one, but many, dozens, hundreds, all layered on top of each other, each whisper like a dagger to her mind. It was a unified chorus, one that tore at her sanity, each word carrying a weight of inevitability. Emma shuddered, her stomach lurching. She wanted to cover her ears to block out the voices, but they were inside her mind. They were her thoughts, twisting and contorting, and they wouldn't stop. "You cannot fight us. You never could." The words echoed in her mind like a mantra, the cadence of the voices like a heartbeat, rhythmic and unyielding. Emma's chest tightened, the pressure of the words suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she didn't know how. Every time she tried to focus, to center herself, the walls would shift, the shadows would close in tighter, and the voices would grow louder, more insistent. She felt something deep within her stir, an instinct, something primal, and it frightened her. She had to escape, she had to escape. She gripped the stone harder, the cold seeping into her skin, but it wasn't enough. The stone was no longer the beacon of power it once was. It felt like a weight, a curse, chaining her to this place, to them. The energy it once radiated had turned inward, consuming her, and she was left with nothing but the crushing weight of its influence. Then, in the distance, a new sensation, an unfamiliar pull. Something not from the shadows, but from somewhere else. It was soft, almost tender, like a hand reaching out from the darkness. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew stronger with every passing second. Emma turned toward the pull, her movements slow, deliberate. There was something there, something calling her, pulling her with a force she couldn't explain. She didn't know what it was, but it felt different. It felt like hope, a small spark in the overwhelming darkness. She stepped forward, her legs shaky, but the moment she moved, the shadows seemed to recoil, pulling back as though they were frightened of whatever it was that was pulling her. Her mind raced. What was this? Why was it retreating? What did it want with her? The voices in her head, their voices, grew frantic, urgent. They hissed, their words breaking into garbled phrases that Emma couldn't understand. But their meaning was clear. They were losing their grip on her. "You can't leave," the voice shouted, its tone venomous, dripping with malice. "You will stay here forever." But Emma didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The pull was growing stronger now, more insistent, and Emma felt it deep in her chest. The energy was warm, comforting, like a light pushing back against the cold, oppressive darkness. She took another step, and another, her pace quickening as the pull intensified. The stone in her hand flared, its warmth returning, its power rising again, and the shadows that had once suffocated her began to recede, slowly at first, then faster, until they were nothing more than wisps in the air, swirling around her as though they were afraid. The further she walked, the clearer the pull became, until she could see it, her, the figure. The woman stood before her, tall and elegant, bathed in a soft, glowing light. Her face was serene, her features radiant and glowing with an ethereal beauty that Emma couldn't comprehend. She seemed to be made of the very essence of the light itself, her form shifting in and out of clarity, like she was part of the very space Emma was in. Her eyes, those eyes, were filled with compassion, and yet there was something else there, something deep and ancient, like they had seen the end of time itself. The woman's voice was soft, but it carried a weight of authority that Emma couldn't ignore. "You've come far," she said, her voice a gentle melody that contrasted with the harsh voices still echoing in Emma's mind. "But this place is not for you. You do not belong here." Emma stepped forward, trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mouth was dry, but she managed to find her voice. "Who are you?" she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. The woman smiled, and though her smile was warm, Emma could feel the sorrow behind it. "I was once like you," she said, "trapped in this place, bound to its will. But there is always a choice. There is always a way out." The shadows around them stirred at her words, as though they were reacting to the woman's presence. But the woman was unafraid. Her gaze never wavered from Emma's, and for the first time since arriving here, Emma felt the weight of the darkness lessen. "But you have to understand," the woman continued, her voice growing softer, more urgent. "You cannot escape unless you understand what binds you. The stone, it is not just a tool. It is a key to unlocking the truth, to freeing yourself." Emma's mind raced as she processed the words. The stone was a key. To what? Before she could ask, the woman raised her hand, and the air around them shifted, the light intensifying until it was nearly blinding. The darkness retreated, but not completely. It still lingered, like a shadow in the corners of Emma's mind, threatening to return at any moment. The woman's figure began to shimmer, her form fading into the light. "You must make a choice," she said, her voice echoing like a distant memory. "Will you accept the power the stone offers, or will you let it consume you?" The light around her intensified until Emma could no longer see her. The warmth enveloped her, and the last thing she heard was the woman's final words, a whisper in the wind. "Choose wisely." And then, silence. The silence was deafening. Emma felt herself floating, weightless, suspended in the void once again, the light from the woman's presence now nothing more than a distant memory. Her chest tightened as she struggled to process the overwhelming flood of thoughts in her mind. The words echoed in her head, reverberating like a bell. Choose wisely. What did it mean? What choice did she have? The stone in her hand felt like a heavy burden now, its energy pulsing in time with her racing heartbeat. What is the stone? Her fingers gripped it tightly, the cool surface of the stone slick with the sweat of her palm. It seemed almost to hum in her grasp, as if it were alive. She could feel the same pull from before, the same overwhelming force drawing her back to the darkness, to the figures that haunted her every step. But now there was something else, something new. The stone is a key. The woman's words played in her mind like a broken record. The stone was a key, but to what? And why had it chosen her? She had never asked for this, never wanted to be pulled into this nightmare world where she was constantly pursued by these shadows, by these creatures. But it was too late for regrets. Whatever the stone was, whatever it meant, it had bound her to this place, to them. Emma staggered, the ground beneath her shifting again, the floor pulsing like a heartbeat. She was being pulled in two directions, one toward the light, toward the woman who had shown her a glimpse of hope, and the other toward the shadows, the dark figures who whispered threats and promises of power. But Emma wasn't sure she could trust either. They both wanted something from her. The woman had spoken of a choice, but what was the price of that choice? And what would happen if she chose wrong? The weight of the stone in her hand grew heavier, its pull growing stronger with every passing second. She could feel its power coursing through her veins, a dark, insidious power that whispered to her, promising strength, control, everything she had ever wanted. But there was a price, a cost she couldn't yet understand. As if on cue, the shadows stirred again, swirling around her like a storm. The figures emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They moved silently, their forms shifting with each step, their presence oppressive, suffocating. Emma's heart raced as she backed away from them, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the stone's energy building, its warmth radiating in her palm, but it wasn't enough to keep them at bay. One of the figures stepped forward, its elongated form flickering in and out of view. Its face was hidden, but its eyes, those eyes, pierced into her like they could see everything she was, everything she feared. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down Emma's spine. "You belong here now. You will never leave." Emma's chest tightened, panic rising in her throat. She felt trapped, cornered, like there was nowhere left to run. The stone in her hand burned, the heat of it spreading through her fingers, but she couldn't let go. It was a part of her now, as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. The energy from the stone pulsed again, and for the briefest of moments she felt a surge of power. But at what cost? The figure's voice echoed in her mind, its words a warning, a threat. She could feel its power, its control over her, trying to break through. She had no idea how much longer she could fight it. The darkness was closing in, the walls pressing down on her, the figures moving ever closer. She had no choice but to confront them, to face whatever lay at the heart of this nightmare. "Leave me alone," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. She tried to stand taller, to fight back, but the figure only laughed, the sound low and mocking. "You cannot command us," it said, its voice dripping with disdain. "You are nothing here, just a pawn. The stone has chosen you, but you are nothing more than a tool. We will make sure you understand that." The darkness around her thickened, a suffocating presence that pressed against her chest, making it harder to breathe. She felt herself losing strength, her body growing weaker with each passing second. Her fingers slipped on the stone, and for a moment she thought it might fall from her hand, might break into 1,000 pieces. But the stone didn't fall. Instead, the energy within it surged, flooding her with an overwhelming force that took her breath away. The power was almost unbearable, filling every part of her, but Emma refused to let it control her. She clenched her fist, holding onto it with every ounce of strength she had left. This was hers. This was the key to her escape. Suddenly, the figure lunged at her, its shadowy form a blur of motion, and Emma instinctively raised her hand, the stone glowing with an intense light. The figure hesitated, recoiling from the light as if it had been burned. For a moment, Emma felt like she had won, like the stone had finally answered her call, had finally given her the strength to fight back. But then the laughter returned. Cold, mocking, cruel. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the figure spat. "You think you have power? You are nothing." The words cut through her like a knife, and the light from the stone flickered, fading just as quickly as it had come. The stone's power was draining, slipping away, and Emma could feel it. She was losing her grip. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Emma closed her eyes, focusing all of her energy on the stone, on the power it held. She could feel it pulsing, thrumming in her hand as though it were responding to her call. And then something happened. Crack. A sudden jolt of energy. The stone exploded with light. Emma gasped as the world around her seemed to shatter. The air turned cold and the shadows recoiled, screeching as the light surged outward, pushing them back. She was thrown to the ground, the force of the explosion knocking the breath from her lungs. The stone slipped from her fingers, rolling away from her as she gasped for air. When she opened her eyes, the figures were gone. The darkness was retreating, fading away as the light filled the space, illuminating everything around her. The stone lay in front of her, glowing faintly, but there was no warmth left in it. No power. It was empty. Emma crawled toward it, her hands shaking as she picked it up. It was just a stone now. No more power. No more pull. She stood slowly, her mind spinning with what had just happened. The figures, the voices, they were gone. For now. But what did it mean? Had she won? Or had she just taken the first step into something even worse? The silence around her was deafening, and for the first time since arriving in this place, Emma was truly alone. Emma's pulse raced in her chest as she stood there, staring at the stone in her hand. The faint glow it emitted was the only light in the otherwise pitch-black space. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt as though the entire world had been held in suspense, waiting for her next move. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone, and with it, the pressure that had been suffocating her. But something didn't feel right. The silence, the stillness, it was too calm, too perfect. The stone was nothing but a dull rock now. The warmth, the power, the energy that had surged through it were gone, vanished like smoke in the wind. She could feel the emptiness in her hand, as though the very essence of it had been stripped away. But why? Hadn't the woman said it was a key? Hadn't she told Emma that it could unlock the truth? The truth. The words echoed in her mind, but they felt distant now. What truth? She had faced the horrors of this place, the shadows that wanted to claim her, and she had felt the stone's power, its grip on her. But now that it was gone, she had nothing. Nothing but a broken promise. A stone that had failed her. Emma looked around, the shadows retreating into the corners of the room, yet never completely disappearing. They were always there, watching, waiting, as if they were biding their time. She could feel their gaze on her, even though she couldn't see them. They had been defeated, at least for now, but she knew they weren't gone for good. They were patient. They always had been. And with each passing second, Emma felt them creeping closer again. Her heart skipped a beat. What had she done? The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she truly understood. The woman had given her hope, had told her she could escape, but had she really been offering a way out, or had she simply been another part of the game? A piece of the puzzle, like the stone, a means to an end? What is happening here? Emma muttered aloud to herself, her voice breaking the silence, and the sound of it echoed like a lonely cry in the emptiness. She took a step forward, and the floor beneath her seemed to respond. The stone in her hand was now a lifeless object, its once powerful hum replaced by a quiet, almost mocking silence. She had no answers. She had no more weapons, no more power. What now? How was she supposed to fight this? The more she walked, the more the emptiness seemed to press in on her. The walls were breathing again, slowly at first, their pulsations barely perceptible but undeniable. It was as though the very air had become thicker, heavier. The temperature dropped, and she could feel a chill creeping into her bones, deep into her marrow. It felt like the very essence of this place was closing in around her, squeezing the life out of her, and it was suffocating. The shadows didn't move. They didn't whisper. But she knew they were there, just out of sight. They were everywhere. In the air. In the ground. In her mind. They were watching, waiting, biding their time. A cold shiver ran down Emma's spine, but this time, it wasn't from the chill in the air. This was something different. This was the unmistakable feeling of being followed. Her senses screamed at her to turn around, to look behind her, but she refused to. She didn't need to see them, she could feel them. And then it happened. The silence shattered. A shrill scream, high-pitched and agonizing, tore through the air, and Emma froze. Her heart stopped for a moment, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a scream, but it wasn't her own. It was a voice that was familiar yet not. A voice from the depths of her memory, from a place she had long forgotten. It was a cry for help, a desperate plea that echoed through the darkness. Emma, help me, please. The words rang out, distorted and frantic, and Emma's blood ran cold. She didn't know who it was, but the voice was unmistakable. It was someone she knew, someone she cared about. The voice was pleading, calling her name, begging for salvation. Her mind raced. Was this real? Was this another trick, another twisted illusion designed to break her? The voice screamed again, and this time, Emma couldn't ignore it. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she gripped the stone tightly. Even though she knew the stone was powerless now, she still clung to it, as though it could somehow restore what had been lost. Please? The voice, no, the cry, was so close now. Emma's body moved before her mind had a chance to catch up. She ran. She ran as fast as she could, the sounds of her footsteps the only thing she could focus on. The voice was still calling to her, closer now, louder now, urging her to reach it, to reach them. She rounded a corner, her breathing erratic, and suddenly she stopped, almost tripping over her own feet. There, in the center of the room, was a figure. A shadow. A person. Their back was turned to her, their silhouette outlined by a faint, otherworldly light. Emma, the voice whispered again, and this time it was soft. It was the same voice, but there was something different about it. Something darker. More sinister. Slowly, Emma approached the figure, each step heavy, her pulse racing as her senses screamed at her to stop. Every instinct told her this was wrong, but the pull was irresistible. The voice was hers, it was calling for her, and she had to answer it. The figure turned. Emma's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't who she thought it was. Standing before her was a man, a stranger, his face hidden beneath a hood. His features were shadowed, obscured by the darkness. But there was something in his eyes, something that she recognized. It wasn't the light of hope she had been hoping for. It wasn't the warmth of the woman who had given her guidance. It was the cold, empty stare of someone who had already given in. His lips curled into a smile. No, a grin, cold and cruel. It sent a jolt of fear straight to Emma's core. She took an instinctive step back, but he was faster. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, his grip iron tight. You shouldn't have come here, he hissed, his voice low, filled with malice. This was never about escape. You'll learn soon enough. We are all trapped here. The darkness around them thickened, swirling with a life of its own, and Emma struggled against his hold, trying to break free, but the harder she fought, the more his grip tightened. And then he spoke again, and this time his words chilled her to the bone. You are the last piece of the puzzle. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The last piece? What did that mean? What was he talking about? Before she could ask, before she could do anything, the shadows closed in, swallowing the room, the figure, and the world she had known. Everything went black. Emma's mind raced as darkness consumed her. It was an all-encompassing void that swallowed her whole, yet she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. The air was thick, suffocating, but strangely familiar. She could feel her body, the cold floor beneath her, but her limbs were heavy, as though she were trapped in a thick fog, unable to move or even breathe freely. A strange hum filled the air, like an ancient, forgotten song vibrating through the very bones of the earth. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl, the kind of hum that seemed to reach into your soul, tugging at something deep within you. Something old, something dark. Then she felt it, the pressure. It wasn't just in her chest, it was everywhere. The weight of the world was on her, pressing down so hard she couldn't think. 1,000 thoughts screamed at once in her mind, and all of them pointed to one thing: escape. But how? The last thing she remembered was the figure, the man with the hood, grabbing her, his icy grip sending a shock through her body. But now she was alone. Wasn't she? She strained her senses, but the stillness around her was deafening, suffocating. The shadows had swallowed her, but had they taken her, or was she still there? And then she heard it. A whisper. Soft, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It wasn't the man's. It was something else. It felt wrong, alien, as if it didn't belong here, as if it were an intrusion in the already twisted world she inhabited. Emma, the voice called, but it wasn't from the shadows. It was from within. It was in her mind, like a thought made flesh, like a memory twisting into something darker. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice again. It was insistent, urgent. Emma, you must listen, listen to me. It wasn't the stone calling. It wasn't the man. It was the woman. The woman. She had thought the woman was gone. She had thought the woman was just a fleeting illusion, a figure created by the very darkness that sought to consume her. But now, in the oppressive quiet, her voice was clearer, more distinct than ever. I am still here, the woman's voice whispered through her mind. You must understand. The choice, your choice, is not yet made. The words hit Emma like a slap to the face, snapping her back to the present. The choice. She remembered the woman telling her she had to choose. Choose wisely, but the weight of that decision had always felt too heavy to bear. Now, with the figure's words still echoing in her ears, with the dark whispers closing in on her once again, it felt even more impossible. I have no choice, Emma muttered out loud, her voice shaky, desperate. You said I could escape. You promised me. Escape is an illusion, the woman's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. You cannot escape this place. Not yet. Not until you understand what it is. What you are. Emma clenched her fists, her fingers curling around nothing but air. What she was. You are the key, the woman continued, her voice trembling with urgency now. The stone you held, its power was never meant to be wielded by you. It was meant to draw you here, to draw all of you together. You are the final piece. The last thread to unravel the tapestry. Emma's mind reeled. The final piece? The last thread? She couldn't understand it. It didn't make sense. How could she be the key? The darkness is not what it seems, the woman whispered, as if speaking directly into Emma's soul. It is not a force to be feared. It is a force to be embraced. You cannot fight it. You cannot run from it. Her breath quickened, her chest rising and falling with each jagged inhale. She felt her knees buckle beneath her, and for a brief moment she thought she might collapse. Everything inside her screamed that she had to run. She had to get away, to leave this nightmare behind. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to go. A low hum vibrated beneath her feet, and Emma gasped as the ground shifted once again. The room, if it could even be called that, seemed to pulse with life. The shadows were pulling at her, tugging like they were hungry, eager to consume her whole. She couldn't tell which direction they were coming from. The air felt thick and suffocating. Every sense was overloaded. It is time for you to choose, Emma, the woman's voice came again, now laced with an emotion Emma could barely recognize. Was it pity or something darker? Choose the light and you will remain trapped. Choose the shadows and you will become one with them. Emma's hands trembled as she lifted them, looking at her own shaking fingers. The weight of it all was so heavy, too heavy to bear. The woman's words, the stone, the figures, the shadows that never seemed to leave her alone. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma realized something. The choice wasn't just about the stone or the woman or the shadows. It was about her, what she was willing to accept. The darkness had already taken so much from her. But there was still a part of her that resisted, still a part of her that clung to the idea that there could be something better, something more than this endless nightmare. What was there? The voice of the woman faded, and Emma was left in the silence again. The shadows were gone, for now, but the air still hung heavy with their presence. She could feel them lingering just out of sight, watching her, waiting for her to make her decision. The stone, now completely devoid of its power, lay discarded on the ground where it had fallen when the figures attacked her. It was just a stone again. But Emma knew better now. The stone had always been more than it appeared. It had always been a tool, a link in the chain that had bound her to this place. And it still had a part to play in the dark game she had found herself caught in. But what was the next move? She couldn't go back. She couldn't undo the things she had seen, the choices she had made. But one thing was clear. The path she had been walking had no end. No resolution. She wasn't finished yet. Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself as she moved forward, one step at a time. Each step was a choice. But which choice would she make? The answer came too quickly. The shadows closed in, and with them everything began again.